strap in, because in this video I'm going to be explaining you literally everything that a beginner backpacker would need to know. How to buy hiking gear, how to save weight in your pack, dealing with wild animals, safety tips, and much more. Essentially, the main idea for this video is that instead of watching 30 different videos on YouTube, you're going to need to watch just one video. This video where I explain you literally everything. And if you want to skip ahead, here are the timestamps. Let's start by talking about hiking gear, because even though backpacking isn't just about hiking gear, unfortunately a very large portion of it is. Whenever you're packing your backpack, one really useful thing to do is to follow a checklist so that you don't forget to bring anything. I actually have a checklist that I use myself that I recently published on my website for everyone to use, so feel free to bookmark that page for future use if you need to. Anyway, once you open this checklist, you're going to notice that you're going to need a lot of different things to go out backpacking, even if we aren't counting all the optional ones. But don't worry, because during this video we're going to go through all of this gear and I'm going to be explaining you what to look out for when buying it, and also share some tips on how to use it based on my own personal experience. If currently you don't have anything from this list and you need to purchase everything from scratch, then you're going to need to spend at least $500. And that's actually a really budget option, because medium setups usually cost between $1,000 to $1,500, and ultralight setups can cost even upwards of $2,000, even $3,000. As a beginner, it's totally fine if you start with an affordable setup. It's going to be a bit harder, but definitely doable. And also, don't be afraid to buy second-hand hiking gear. In a lot of cases, actually buying second-hand hiking gear that's higher in quality from better brands is preferable over buying new affordable gear, because hiking gear is very repairable and you can do a lot of these repairs yourself. Ideally, your whole backpacking setup, together with the backpack, tent, food, water, and everything else, should weigh no more than 20% of your own body weight. So, for example, if I weigh 70 kilos, I'd want my whole setup to weigh no more than 14 kilograms. If it's heavier than this, then I'll have more pain in my shoulders, in my back, in my legs. I'll be more likely to get injuries, and I also won't be able to do those really long distances. However, take this with a very big grain of salt, because it really depends on your own physical condition. For example, if at the beginning your whole setup weighs 25, even 30% of your own body weight, it's not the end of the world. In the beginning, when you're just starting out, in my opinion, it's way more important to look at the function, durability, comfort, and price instead of the weight. So what I'm trying to say is, yes, of course, the weight matters. It matters a lot, but as a beginner, don't get too hung up on buying ultralight hiking gear. Now let's start talking about each individual piece of hiking gear, and let's start with the backpack, because it is the most important thing in your setup. So essentially there are three main types of backpacks. Ones with external frames, which people used several decades ago and now are honestly almost extinct. Ones with internal frames, which is this one, and frameless packs. As a beginner, I definitely recommend that you avoid frameless packs and go with an internal frame backpack, which means that it will have some kind of a built-in internal frame over here between the shoulder straps and the hip belt, and this will help you with distributing a lot of the weight over to the hip belt, so over to your legs instead of your shoulders. I would recommend frameless packs only to experienced hikers that have a complete ultralight setup. Otherwise, all of the weight will be here centered around your shoulders and you'll get a lot of shoulder pain. Some internal frame backpacks have a built-in plate that works as the internal frame, and some have two removable rails that are usually built from aluminum or carbon. Whichever type you choose, it doesn't really matter as long as the backpack has an internal frame. One other really important thing when buying a backpack is looking at the hip belt. It should be nice, big, sturdy, and come with a lot of padding, because that's where you get most of the weight centered around the hip belt, so that you can carry it with your legs. You should also have adjustable shoulder straps, a sternum strap, and two load lifters so that you can adjust it to fit your own unique upper body and so that it fits you very well. Some other useful features to look out for in a backpack, in my opinion, are a very big and stretchy front pocket where you can put, for example, your rain jacket or down jacket without opening the backpack, a top pocket for organizing some of the smaller things, two side bottle pockets to store your water, some straps at the bottom so that you can attach a foam pad there, some good padding on the back of the backpack as well as the shoulder straps so that it's comfortable, and also make sure that it has enough gaps to allow enough ventilation so that it isn't too sweaty when you're hiking in very hot days. And finally, another useful feature is having hip belt pockets to organize some of the smaller items. You can of course live without some of these features, but I mentioned them here because I think they are useful in one way or another. The main size measurement of backpacks is the volume in liters. If you'll be hiking mostly only in the summer, then definitely get something between 50 to 60 liters. Maybe you can go even a bit lower than that, maybe 45 liters if you have a more lightweight setup. But if you'll also be hiking in the cold season, then you do need to be prepared for more eventual things that could happen, and you need to carry more gear. So definitely go with a bigger backpack that's at least 60 liters in size. From my own experience, I would personally pay no attention to how water resistant the backpack material is and instead protect it from the inside, because you do need to protect all of your gear somehow to keep it from getting wet. My preferred solution is using a pack liner, which costs about $5, and essentially you put everything in here and then inside of the backpack. This thing weighs almost nothing, it's cheap, and it's 100% waterproof. One other thing that you could do is organize everything in dry sacks. For example, here I have a bigger one for all of my sleeping gear, and here I have several smaller ones to organize my food, electronics, and everything else. These allow you to be a bit more organized. They're way more durable compared to a pack liner, but they're also a bit more expensive. One other budget-friendly option is to just use a trash bag instead of a pack liner, because it essentially works the same way and it costs almost nothing. And also I want to briefly touch on rain covers, which essentially go over the pack and they protect it from getting wet. I personally don't like them because when you're wearing the pack, usually some kind of water can get inside from the back and your stuff gets wet anyway. That's why I prefer to not have any rain covers and instead protect all of my gear with these things. And now I'll show you how to adjust a backpack, because an improperly adjusted one will for sure result in more shoulder pain than needed. So you start by loosening all of the straps, the hip belt, the shoulder straps, the chest strap, as well as the load lifters. Now that everything is loosened, make sure that the hip belt is sitting straight on your hip bones. So you find the bone that's sticking out. Mine is roughly over here. You center the hip belt straight on top of it, over here, and tighten it. Make sure to tighten it quite a bit, because it's really important that the hip belt is tight, because that way you can get most of the weight balanced on your legs instead of your shoulders. Now that the hip belt is nice and tight, I'm going to be adjusting my shoulder straps to a point where I can start to feel them digging into my shoulders. Then I'm going to release them just a bit because I don't want them to dig into my shoulders. They're quite loose now. Also make sure that they're both in equal length, because otherwise one will dig into one of the shoulders more than the other one. The next one is the chest strap or the sternum strap. So it should be sitting roughly at this height. Make sure that one side isn't higher than the other one. And then you adjust it a bit. Again, you can adjust it where you can start to feel it digging into your chest a bit, and then release it just a tiny bit so that it isn't digging into anything anymore. It should feel something like this, more or less. And finally, you need to tighten the load lifters. Again, don't tighten them too much, because otherwise they'll pull your shoulders away and you'll get more shoulder pain than needed. There's also one other quick way of determining whether you've adjusted something wrong. There shouldn't be any gaps here on the shoulder strap, and also the load lifters should be at a downwards angle or at a flat angle. They shouldn't be lower than your shoulders. Otherwise, you need to adjust the torso length of the backpack or keep readjusting the shoulder straps or something like that until it looks something like this. And now in the end, you should feel like you're carrying most of the weight with your legs. And these three straps over here, the load lifters, the chest strap, and the shoulder straps, should feel a bit tight, but definitely not too tight. Essentially, you want to tighten them to a point where, as you're walking, the backpack isn't moving around. It's pretty firm on your back, but it's not at the same time pulling on your shoulders or on your back. Here I have a fully packed backpack, essentially something that I would take on any normal 3-season multi-day hiking trip. And now let's unpack it all together so that hopefully you get a better idea on how you should be packing your backpack. Let's start with this area over here. So over here I have a waist pack as well as 2 hip belt pockets on my backpack. Inside of the hip belt pockets, I usually keep all the things that are most important to me. For example, my SOS device, my car keys, as well as my phone. And in the fanny pack, I usually keep keep all the quick grab items that I might need during the hike. For example, I might keep a snack bar over here, hand sanitizer, wallet, a power bank, and stuff like that. On each side of the backpack, I carry a water bottle, a regular 1.5 liter water bottle, so that I always have roughly 3 liters of water in total. In this big stretchy pocket over here, I keep some lightweight items that I might need to access quickly during the hike without needing to open the backpack. So for example, I might keep my gloves and my hat over here, a rain jacket, as well as a fleece. All of the things that I might need to put on quickly. Now, if you don't have enough space inside of the backpack and you need to attach something to the exterior, make sure to do it down at the bottom. And ideally, also put only lightweight items here, like for example, a foam mat instead of a heavy tent or something like that. That's because if you attach something heavy over here in the middle, or even worse here at the top, then it will for sure pull the pack away from your shoulders and you'll get a lot of shoulder pain. And now let's look at all the items that I carry inside of the pack. So at the top, I usually keep all the items that I might need to access quickly during the day. So for example, I keep my food bag in here, my electronics bag, my first aid kit, my hygiene kit, and my repair kit, as well as my cooking kit. Then I have another bigger dry sack down here at the bottom, and in here I keep all the items that I'll only need in the evening when I've set up my tent, and also all the items that I need to protect from becoming wet. So for example, here I have my sleeping bag, my sleeping pad, my pillow, as well as all of my extra clothing that I might need during the evening. And finally, over here at the bottom, I carry my tent. I usually don't put it in a tent stack, I just stuff it down at the bottom of the pack together with the stakes, because sometimes it's still a bit wet from the morning condensation or in case it rained during the night. So I always like to keep it at the bottom of the pack so that it doesn't touch all of my other stuff. Of course, every backpacker likes to organize their stuff in a different way. However, most backpackers usually organize their backpacks in a similar fashion. So if you pack your backpack like this, you should be good to go. This video does not have any sponsors. Having said that, it took me an extremely long time to make, so if you like hiking and if you want to support this channel, go and check out trailgoals.com. Together with my wife, we make posters for many different long-distance hiking trails, like for example the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail, the Camino de Santiago, and almost 200 other hiking trails across the world. If you've done a hiking trail that you're proud of, chances are that we've made a poster for it, which will allow you to display this adventure on your wall essentially forever. Of course, my subscribers get a discount as well. By entering the discount code OscarHikes, you'll get 10% off your entire order. Thank you for not skipping, and now let's get back to the video. When it comes to shelters where you sleep in during the night, you have quite a few options to choose from. You can choose a tarp, a hammock, or a tent. As you can see, personally, I am a tent guy and I don't really have that much experience with tarps or hammocks. But just so you know, a lot of people do use them because they're usually lighter and also usually a bit cheaper. I personally don't like hammocks because I think they aren't as comfortable. You can't put your stuff inside of them during the night, and also you always need 2 trees to set up a hammock, which sometimes is pretty hard to find if you're hiking in the mountains. And I do personally own a tarp, but I don't use it as much compared to a tent because they are harder to set up and they also have big gaps where rain, wind, and mosquitoes can enter. So that's why I think for most people, the most reasonable option is to get a tent. Tents are essentially divided into 2 main groups. Freestanding tents, which is this orange one over here, and these 2 are trekking pole tents. Except for the vestibule area over here, trekking pole tents usually have only single wall instead of 2 walls. And for the main construction, it uses 1 or 2 poles, which you can substitute with a trekking pole if you use trekking poles. Because of these 2 reasons, trekking pole tents are usually lighter compared to freestanding tents, which is why you'll see a lot of thru hikers using trekking pole tents. But they do have some downsides as well, and the most important one is condensation. So because they have only a single wall instead of 2 walls, there are less holes for air to come through, so there's less ventilation, which means that the moist air that you breathe out from your lungs stays trapped inside of the tent and it accumulates on the walls. So when you wake up, the tent walls will have more condensation. They also usually have a bit less space inside compared to a freestanding tent because the tent walls come at a sharper angle, so there's a bit less room inside. And also in very high winds, they aren't as durable. I'm talking about extremely high winds because they have less flexibility compared to a freestanding tent. Freestanding tents are called freestanding because theoretically you can take out the tent stakes and move the tent around, so it's standing by itself. If you would do that with a trekking pole tent, it would immediately collapse. Freestanding tents usually have two walls, so it has an inner tent that's capable of standing by itself, and on top it's covered by mesh, so it isn't waterproof. And it also has a completely waterproof rainfly that goes on top. For the main construction, they use flexible poles instead of trekking poles, which means that in very high winds, it performs much better because it has a lot more give. They also have other benefits over trekking pole tents. First of all, they're easier and quicker to set up compared to a trekking pole tent. They also have less condensation because of a two-wall system, which results in more ventilation. And they also usually have a bit more room inside of the tent because the tent walls are attached at a wider angle. The only downsides for freestanding tents are that they take up a bit more space inside of your backpack, and they're also heavier. Still, despite this, because of these many other benefits, I would 100% recommend for a beginner to get a freestanding tent instead of a trekking pole one. Tents are also divided into two other categories, size and season. The unwritten rule of thumb between hikers is that if you want to have a bit more comfortable experience inside of the tent, and if you want to keep all of your stuff inside of the tent instead of the vestibules, then get a tent that's rated for one size larger or half a size larger than the person's planning to sleep inside of the tent. So for example, if I'm sleeping in my one-person tent, I usually have to keep all of my stuff in the vestibule because there's not enough room inside of the tent. But if I'm sleeping in this two-person tent, it's a way more comfortable experience and I can put everything inside. When you're shopping for new tents, you'll notice that most of them are either 3-season or 4-season. The main difference between them is that 3-season tents will usually have way more mesh and way more areas open for ventilation compared to 4-season tents. I personally prefer to use only 3-season tents, even if I'll be sleeping in winter, because there's one thing that you need to understand. It's mostly the sleeping bag and the sleeping pad that's keeping you warm, not the tent. So my recommendation for you is to get a 3-season tent instead of a 4-season one, unless you're planning to do mountaineering in very high altitudes. In those cases, getting a 4-season tent is much more better. Or if you're planning to do winter camping in very northern climates, think Canada or Scandinavia. If you're on a budget, you can find a tent that costs a bit below $100, something like this one, and it will weigh roughly 2 kilograms. But if you want your tent to weigh closer to 1 kilogram, then you'll need to get a trekking pole tent or an ultralight freestanding tent. And in that case, you'll need to spend at least $250, $300. And now it's time for some tent tips. Everybody hates condensation because it gets all of your stuff wet. So one thing that you can do if it isn't raining outside is to keep 1 or 2 of your vestibules completely open. If you do this, you'll find that there's usually almost no condensation in the morning. But even if it is raining, there's still one thing that you can do. You can open the vestibule halfway, something like this, so that no rain can get inside of the tent and get all of your stuff wet, but at the same time you're getting quite a lot of ventilation. If the ground is too hard, too rocky, and you cannot get your tent stakes inside of it, you can set up a tent using a big rock and a small rock. The first thing that you need to do is make sure that you have a loop at the end of each guy line. Now pass the guy line through this loop to get an adjustable loop, then put the smaller rock inside of this loop so that it's secure. Now set up the guy line to where you want it to be and simply put this bigger rock in front of the smaller one. For this exact tent, I have 2 guy lines at each corner, so what I can do is make another adjustable loop on the second one, use another small rock, and then place it underneath this bigger rock. And that's it. If you want to save a bit of weight inside of your backpack, don't use a tent footprint, which essentially is another sheet that goes underneath the tent floor. Personally, I haven't used one for the past 5 years, and I haven't gotten, at least not any major holes inside of the tent floor. And even if you do get them, they're very easy to fix. Just put a bit of glue on top of it and it's all fixed. But of course, if you do this, you do have to remember to be a bit careful each time when you're setting up the tent to clean all the sticks and rocks, because otherwise you will get holes. A sleeping bag is definitely the most important piece of hiking gear at keeping you warm during the winter. However, before we talk about sleeping bags, you need to understand the difference between sleeping bags and quilts. Sleeping bags usually have a hood that goes around your head, so your face would exit over here, and they have a zipper that opens pretty much all the way so that you can get in and out of the sleeping bag. Quilts, on the other hand, they don't have any hood, so your face will always be out in the open, and also they don't have any zipper, and the way that they attach around the sleeping pad is with 2 or 3 clips over here at the bottom. The bottom part of a quilt is usually very similar to a sleeping bag. It's essentially a closed off compartment where you put in your feet. Some quilts also have a clip over here at the top and also a drawstring, which helps you put it around your neck so that it minimizes the drafts of cold air that would go through as you're turning during the night. The main downside with a quilt is that your head will be a bit colder because it's out in the open and you don't have a hood. And also, as you're turning during the night, you might get some drafts of cold air coming in through over here or over here at the bottom because it doesn't have a zipper. But because it doesn't have a zipper or a hood, it's also lighter, which is the main advantage of quilts over sleeping bags, and why you'll see so many thru-hikers preferring quilts over sleeping bags. Personally, from my own experience, I own 1 quilt and 2 sleeping bags. I would say that sleeping with a quilt is almost as warm as sleeping in a sleeping bag. Regardless of whether you get a sleeping bag or a quilt, they'll always have a temperature rating so that you can understand in what temperatures you can use them in. One rule of thumb is to not look at the lowest of these numbers and always only look at the highest of these numbers. So for example, if here I have -5 and 0 degrees would be the lowest that I would be using this thing in. For most types of 3-season camping, I would recommend getting a sleeping bag with a comfort rating at just below freezing temperatures, so maybe -2, -5 degrees Celsius. And if you're planning on doing winter camping, then definitely get something with a better comfort rating at least -10 degrees Celsius. One other thing to know about these numbers is that oftentimes they're completely wrong, even if they are ISO rated. So one useful thing to do whenever you're buying a sleeping bag is check the reviews, because people will tell you in what kind of temperatures they have successfully used the sleeping bag and when it's warm and when it isn't. Another really important thing to understand when buying a sleeping bag is choosing between synthetic insulation and down insulation. Synthetic insulation is synthetic, so it's made from plastic, but down insulation is a natural material. It's made from animals, from the feathers of animals, usually from geese or ducks. Synthetic sleeping bags are usually way cheaper. For example, usually you can find a good synthetic sleeping bag for around $100, while a comparable down insulation sleeping bag will cost $250, $300 even. The main advantage over down sleeping bags is that they weigh roughly half of a comparable synthetic sleeping bag, and also when you compress them, down sleeping bags will usually take half of the size of a comparable synthetic sleeping bag. As a beginner, I definitely recommend that you go with synthetic insulation. If, however, you have the budget or you've been hiking for a while and you want to upgrade your gear to get something lighter, then it's definitely worth it to upgrade to a down insulation sleeping bag. And the last thing that I wanted to talk about are sleeping bag liners, which are essentially thin pieces of fabric that go inside of the sleeping bag to make it a bit warmer. They're usually pretty cheap. They cost around $20 to $50 depending on which one you get, and they offer a good way of making your sleeping bag a bit warmer. For example, if your sleeping bag is rated for 0 degrees comfort, then by putting a liner inside of it, you can use it down to temperatures maybe -3, -5 degrees Celsius. So as a beginner, I would definitely recommend you to take advantage of this. So instead of buying another sleeping bag for sleeping in the winter, you can just buy a liner, which is way cheaper, and it will make your current sleeping bag a bit warmer. One other thing that some people do is just put another summer sleeping bag inside of their current sleeping bag when sleeping in winter. Of course, this solution is very heavy and it also removes a lot of free space inside of the backpack. However, if you currently have 2 sleeping bags and you don't want to spend a lot on a winter sleeping bag, it's a solution that you can do because it's cheap, simple, and it works. I often see a lot of beginners underestimate how important a sleeping pad is at keeping you warm. Honestly, I did this myself when I just started out. I purchased a cheap sleeping pad from Amazon, not even paying attention to what kind of temperatures it's rated for. And during the night, the temperature dropped down to maybe -5 degrees Celsius. And let me tell you, that was one of the coldest nights when I've slept inside of a tent. I remember I woke up roughly once every hour to exercise a bit, to increase my blood flow and increase my body temperature and also warm up. near the fire, so I had to keep the fire going for the whole night. So the most important thing to understand when buying a sleeping pad is the R value, which tells you how much insulation a sleeping pad has inside and how warm will it be. A sleeping pad with an R value below 2 will only be good for summer hiking. An R value between 3.5 will usually be good for 3-season hiking, and for winter hiking you definitely need an R value of at least 4.5, maybe even 5, depending on where you live. The good news about R value is that it combines. So for example, if this sleeping mat has an R value of 2 and this one has an R value of 4, if I put them together, one on top of the other one, now the total R value is 6, which is good for temperatures down to maybe even minus 10 degrees Celsius. One thing to note here is that the R values aren't always correct. Some manufacturers tend to over-exaggerate them, so one important thing to do, just like when buying a sleeping bag, is to also read the reviews and see in what kind of temperatures people have used these sleeping pads in. You can probably tell that these 3 sleeping pads are completely different, so now let's talk about the 3 main types of sleeping pads, which are foam mats, self-inflating mats, and inflatable sleeping mats. Foam sleeping mats are usually the cheapest. They usually have an R rating of below 2, which means that they're only usable in summer, and they also take up the most amount of space inside of your backpack. Now, having said that, they're my preferred choice whenever I'm hiking during the summer. You can't puncture them because they aren't inflatable. They're also really lightweight, and the bigger size doesn't really matter because I usually attach them to the exterior of the pack, which means that I still have a lot of space inside of the pack. Another benefit is that if I'm keeping them on the exterior of the pack, I can take it off from the backpack very easily, unfold it and put it on the ground, and I can lay on it and take a nice break. The next type is self-inflating sleeping mats, which means that they usually have some kind of foam inside of the mat. However, they're also inflatable. They're usually more expensive compared to a foam mat, starting at $50–60. They usually have a pretty high R value, maybe even 4 or 5 that aren't that expensive, so they're a good option for beginners who want to do 3-season and winter hiking. The main downside with them is that they're pretty heavy, and they also take up a bit more space inside of your backpack compared to an inflatable sleeping mat. And the last type is inflatable sleeping mats, which are usually the lightest. They take up the least amount of space inside of your backpack, and they're also the most comfortable because they're pretty thick. The main downside with inflatable sleeping mats is the price. If you want to buy a good inflatable sleeping mat that's lightweight and usable in winter with an R value of at least 4, you have to spend at least $150. It's also pretty easy to puncture them. For example, now if I'd sleep on this mat, on this rocky and spiky ground, I would probably get a hole, but at least the good news is that these holes usually are pretty easy to fix. So as a beginner, you probably won't be hiking during the winter anyway. You'll probably start during the summer when the weather is nice and good. So my recommendation is to definitely start with a foam sleeping pad. And then if you do decide to go out when the temperatures are colder, not only in the summer, then you can invest in another sleeping mat. I would recommend going with an inflatable sleeping mat with an R value of over 3.5. I recommend skipping self-inflating mats altogether because in my opinion they're too cumbersome and they're also too heavy, except if you're planning to do winter hiking on a budget. And the last thing that you should pay attention to when shopping for a sleeping pad is the length and also the width. For example, me personally, I'm 185 centimeters in height, and when I was buying this orange sleeping pad, I thought it would be long enough for me because I think it was 186 centimeters. However, whenever I'm sleeping on it, I didn't account for the fact that my head should end roughly over here, so my feet are always a bit off from this sleeping mat. So as a rule of thumb, always get a sleeping pad that's longer than your height. For example, this thing, I believe it was 195 centimeters in length, and let me tell you, this thing is way more comfortable than this thing because of this reason. One thing that really sucks is that whenever you set your tent on an incline, and it happens quite frequently in the mountains where you can't find a good flat spot, is that your sleeping pad will slide down into the tent wall overnight, and you'll have to keep readjusting it many times during the night. To keep this from happening, I covered the whole bottom part of my sleeping pad with these small dots of silicone. And let me tell you, it works perfectly. My sleeping mat is not sliding anymore. However, there is one downside to this, that you have to reapply the silicone roughly once every year. For example, on this mat, I applied the silicone 8 months ago, and over these 8 months, I've lost about 50% of these dots. For example, you can see they're missing over here. but here I still have them. So you will have to reapply them over time. And don't be afraid, because this doesn't ruin the mat. It just leaves these marks where the silicone beads fall off, but it doesn't ruin the performance of the mat in any way. Pillows, in my opinion, aren't 100% necessary, but they are a very good quality of life upgrade because you'll get better quality sleep. So they usually cost about $20 to $30, so they're not very expensive. They weigh at around 100 grams, and they take up very little space inside of your backpack. If you do get one, consider getting one that has a strap around the back that goes around the sleeping mat to keep it from sliding off during the night. Another thing to pay attention to is the size. It has to be wide and thick enough so that your head doesn't fall from it during the night. For example, these two pillows I like very much. They're comfortable and I think they're large enough. However, this small pillow from Decathlon, I personally find it too small because my head keeps falling off from it and I lose the pillow somewhere during the night, which isn't necessarily the best experience. Another thing that some hikers do, including myself occasionally, keep your pillow at home. And to save a bit of weight, just put all of your extra clothing inside of a spare dry sack and use it as a pillow. That way you can save a bit more weight. One thing that I really hate is that when the pillow slides off from the sleeping mat during the night, and this happens more frequently than you think because they're both made from synthetic fabrics, which are both very slippery, so it falls off very easily. Luckily, there is a very simple fix to this. You can simply put a t-shirt over the pillow and the mat, and it will keep the pillow from sliding off. Most people that don't do a lot of hiking usually don't understand the need for trekking poles, because why would you need 2 additional poles if you have 2 perfectly normal legs that are perfectly suited for hiking, right? Honestly, I was like that at first. I didn't use any trekking poles, but then I watched one video on YouTube that explained the benefits of trekking poles and why you need to use them. So I decided to give it a go, to try them myself. And let's just say that after a few months of trying them, now you'll very, very rarely find me out on the trail hiking without any trekking poles. So why do you need trekking poles? Well, first of all, they reduce the chances of you getting injuries on your knees or your ankles, because with each step that you're walking with trekking poles, you're reducing the sprain on your legs, on your knees, so less knee injuries, and you also get a bit more balance with each step, so you're less likely to slip and sprain your ankle. Another benefit of trekking poles that I personally really like is that instead of just using your legs, now you're also using your arms, which means that you get an additional exercise for your arms, for your whole arms, as well as your shoulders, which is good for you in the long run. Another benefit is that a lot of tents use trekking poles specifically for keeping them upright, which means that you can save a bit of weight in your backpack by not bringing any tent poles. Another benefit is that you can protect yourself with trekking poles against wild animals, against shepherd dogs that are protective of their herds, and so on. Personally, I like to use them the most in very mountainous areas with a lot of steep uphill and downhill sections, because they allow you to go uphill a bit quicker and a bit easier. And also when you're walking downhill, they give you much more stability, so less injuries and less strain on your knees. The only time when you'll find me not using any trekking poles, although not always, is when I'm hiking on flat sections, because personally, I don't really feel a very, very big benefit of using trekking poles on flat terrains. Personally, I've tried cheap trekking poles that cost $20, and I've also tried expensive trekking poles that cost more than $100 for a pair. And my word of advice is to definitely get the cheaper trekking poles. The main difference between expensive trekking poles and cheap ones is that expensive ones are usually made from carbon fiber or aluminum. So that means that they're a bit lighter, but also a bit less durable. Honestly, I can't really feel a difference if I'm walking with heavier trekking poles or lighter ones, and the cheaper ones are less likely to break if the trekking pole gets stuck between 2 rocks. All right, now here's how to use trekking poles correctly, because oftentimes I see a lot of beginners use trekking poles incorrectly. All trekking poles come with a strap here at the top, and the most important thing to remember is to always put your hand in from the bottom instead of the top, because if you put it in from the top and you fall, you're more likely to get caught between the straps, so you could break or dislocate your fingers or sprain your wrist. The correct way is to put it in from the bottom and then go over the strap like this, so that if you fall, you can release the trekking pole. The next most important thing is to set the correct height, because all trekking poles will usually have some kind of a system to adjust the height. So how you do that is you stand like this, you place your trekking poles in front of you, and your arm should roughly form a 90-degree angle like I have right now. Theoretically, you should also adjust the height of your trekking poles as you're hiking uphill or downhill sections, because for example, if I would be walking uphill a steep section, the trekking pole would need to be lower to form a 90-degree angle. However, in reality, I don't really do that. I set the trekking pole height once when I'm on a flat terrain, and I forget it, because honestly it would take up too much time to keep adjusting your trekking poles as you're hiking. So if you're walking on flat terrain or uphill, always place the trekking pole at the same time as you're placing each step. And instead of using the trekking pole right next to your feet, so for example, right feet, right trekking pole, something like this, don't do that, and instead use the trekking pole that's opposite to your feet. So for example, if I'm placing the right feet, I'm going to be using the left trekking pole, and so on, because this gives you much more stability towards each side, and it also lessens the chances of you getting an injury. Another really important thing to remember is to always place your trekking pole behind your feet, so that if I'm placing my feet over here, I'm going to be placing the trekking pole behind it, so somewhere in this region, so that with each step I'm pushing myself forward instead of backward, because oftentimes I see a lot of beginners placing them next to their feet or in front of it, which just slows you down instead of pushes you forward. All right, and now let's learn how to walk downhill with trekking poles, because it's a completely different technique. So the main idea when walking downhill for trekking poles is, instead of pushing you forward, is to slow you down, because if you're walking without trekking poles, you're slowing yourself down with your knees, and it gives a lot of strain on the knee itself, which causes injuries in the long run. So trekking poles just help you put some of the strain off from your knees, and also it gives you much more balance, so you're less likely to slip. First of all, you need to grab the trekking pole differently. So instead of grabbing it like this, like you would normally when walking on flat terrains or uphill, instead grab it here from the top over your palm and use the trekking pole like this, because it gives you more control over the trekking pole, and it also just feels more natural. There are two main techniques that you can use when walking downhill. One uses one point of contact to the ground, and one uses both trekking poles at the same time. I personally switch between both of them depending on however I feel like at the current moment. So for the first technique that uses only one trekking pole, the timing of when you place your feet and the trekking pole, it doesn't really matter as long as it feels natural. You always need to have at least one trekking pole down to the ground. So left trekking pole, right trekking pole, and the placement of the feet, it doesn't really matter. And this is how it looks like in practice. The second technique is really simple. It uses two trekking poles at the same time. And the main thing to remember here is not to place the trekking poles directly in front of you, but a bit over to the sides, because this gives you a bit more balance. So it looks something like this. And this technique is better if you've injured your knee, or you're tired, or if the terrain is extremely difficult. This technique is slower and it gives you much more control. And lastly, let's talk about the tips of trekking poles. Personally, I like to keep my trekking poles like this, only with a carbide end, because in my opinion, it gives you the most amount of stability in rocks, gravel, and in all kinds of terrains. I also don't keep any caps on the end of my trekking poles, because I personally don't need them, because I'm hiking mostly here in Italy where it's dry and rocky. However, if you're hiking on a wet terrain where the trekking pole keeps digging into the ground too much, then the caps definitely help with this, so keep them on. And they're also useful when hiking in snow. You should always bring some kind of a first aid kit, whether that's a short hike or a longer one, but you can't expect to just buy one, throw it inside of your backpack, and essentially forget about it. You need to learn what's inside the first aid kit, and you need to learn how to use each individual piece of item in every certain situation. You essentially need to be prepared at a moment's notice. I'm definitely not an expert on this myself. I've learned only the basics, so if you want to get more into this and you want to be better prepared, definitely go and check out this video. As for my own experience, I bought a first aid kit, I threw it inside the backpack, and I did exactly what I was telling you not to do. I essentially forgot about it. It had like 100 or even 200 different items, and I realized that I don't actually need most of these items. For example, it had like 50 different bandages ranging from small to medium to large ones, and you most definitely don't need to bring that. You need to bring just one piece of Leuco tape, which you can use in all situations. Because of this reason, a lot of experienced hikers tend to build their own first aid kits by going to the pharmacy and buying certain items that you know that you need to have. The first thing that I did is I swapped the original red bag that came with the first aid kit with a Ziploc bag, because this one is lighter and it's also 100% waterproof. So let's quickly go over my first aid kit. So as mentioned before, I have a piece of Leuco tape that I use to put on top of blisters or to put on top of small open wounds. You should also probably have some kind of foam pads to put on top of larger open wounds, which unfortunately I don't have right now, but I should put it inside of my first aid kit. Then I have a piece of gauze, which I would need to use on top of larger open wounds to essentially seal them. You should also have some kind of disinfectant wipes to clean wounds from dirt and bacteria before you bandage them. You should most definitely have an emergency blanket inside of your first aid kit to avoid hypothermia in case you get wet and cold. Here I have also something for upset stomach. What kind of medicine you use exactly is up to your own preference. Then I have some painkillers, which are one of the most useful things that you can have in your first aid kit. I also always keep a few packs of electrolytes inside of my first aid kit, which are really useful for hiking on hot and sunny days, because then you're losing a lot of electrolytes and you need to replace them to avoid having heat strokes and heat exhaustion episodes. You should also have some kind of scissors inside of your first aid kit to cut the bandages, gauze, and so on. I bring a Swiss Army pocket knife, which has scissors inside of it, so I don't need to bring an extra pair. My pocket knife also comes with tweezers, which are really useful for removing ticks and splinters. You could also use something like this for tick removal. This is a special tick removal tool, which costs about $5 on Amazon. However, me personally, I've tried it and my success rate is better with tweezers. You have to try it yourself and see what works for you better. And lastly, I also have some kind of allergy medication inside of my first aid kit because I have quite a few allergies. Even if you don't have them, it's useful to have a few of these in your first aid kit in case one of your friends has an allergic episode or you meet someone out on the trail. It's just really useful to have this inside of your kit in general. But now let's talk about water filtration, and you essentially have several options to choose from, starting from simply boiling water to adding water treatment pills to squeeze water filters, gravity feed water filters, and finally UV water filters. So the cheapest solution obviously is boiling water, but a lot of hikers don't do this because it takes up a lot of gas in your camping stove, because to boil water you need to boil it at least for 1 minute in lower elevations and up to 3 minutes in higher elevations, because as you go up higher in elevation the boiling temperature increases. Personally, I don't do this because it doesn't remove any physical contaminants like sand, leaves, and so on. The second option that a lot of hikers actually do is water purification tablets, because they are very cheap. You can buy a lot of them for a very small price on Amazon or in any outdoor store, and essentially all you need to do is add 1 tablet for every 1 liter of contaminated water, leave it there for about 30 minutes, and in these 30 minutes it kills all the bacteria, viruses, and so on, so the water becomes safe to drink. But again, this doesn't remove any physical contaminants, so before you filter the water you should put it through a strain of cloth or something like that to remove most of the dirt, leaves, and so on. For hiking specifically, I think the best type of water filter are squeeze water filters, where you essentially fill up a pouch with dirty water, screw on the water filter, then squeeze the pouch, and out comes clean water. These things usually cost about $30 to $50, and they filter out all the bacteria from the water and any other particles larger than that. In reality, this makes the water safe for consumption from most types of water sources that you'd find while backpacking, such as rivers, streams, lakes, ponds, rainwater, and even some smaller puddles if you can't find anything better. The only thing that these things can't filter out is very, very tiny particles that are mixed with the water, such as heavy metals, pesticides, toxins, and so on. They also can't filter out viruses, but honestly, this is only a problem if you're hiking in third world countries where there are some problems with water filtration near larger population centers. So if you're planning on doing a hike in a third world country and you want to filter the water, it's also recommended that you use water purification tablets or that you also boil the water in addition to using the water filter. But if you're hiking in North America, Europe, and other advanced countries where there aren't any problems with water filtration near larger cities, you don't really need to worry about viruses, and this thing is safe to use on its own. I've tried many different squeeze water filters over time, and currently I'm using the Katadyn Be-Free water filter, and I think that currently it is the best one because it has a very good flow rate. It's very easy to clean compared to the Sawyer water filters, and also it isn't too expensive. So if you're looking for a water filter, consider getting this one. The next type of water filter is a gravity feed water filter, and in theory any squeeze water filter can be used as a gravity feed system if you connect a large enough container on top of it and connect it to the water filter via a hose. Gravity filters are usually used for car camping and camping in general, where you don't mind bringing a bit of extra weight and you don't mind that the water is filtered in 20 or 30 minutes. And the last type of water filter are UV water filters. However, I still haven't found a light enough system that would be beneficial to use for hiking specifically. They're mostly only used for car camping or camping in general. One thing to remember with these squeeze water pouches is not to squeeze the pouch too hard. Otherwise, the pouch will burst, especially these Sawyer pouches. They're not very durable. Another thing to remember is that the water filter itself, so this small part over here, you cannot expose it to freezing temperatures, otherwise it will get ruined. So when hiking in winter, one thing that you can do is always keep it inside of your pocket so that your body temperature is able to heat it up and keep it from freezing. And during the night, you can simply throw it inside of your sleeping bag and forget about it. For carrying water, I recommend skipping water bladders, Hygiene bottles, aluminum bottles, and other types of hiking water containers, and simply carry your water in 2 regular 1.5 liter water bottles. I think they're better because, well, first of all, they're lighter. They're also very easily replaceable at any convenience store if one of them breaks. And I also think they're not that bad for the environment compared to using reusable water bottles, because I keep reusing these things as well. And one of them lasts for me for several weeks or even months of hiking. So they're definitely not that bad for the environment. For cooking your food, you got several different options to choose from, but the ones most commonly used by backpackers are alcohol stoves and canister stoves. Personally, I haven't used an alcohol stove myself, but I know that some ultralight hikers do use them because, first of all, they're lighter because you don't need to bring an additional canister, but also 100% alcohol is sometimes easier to get, especially in some third world countries where these canisters are almost impossible to find. However, most types of backpackers that you'll find out on the trail, including me, use canister stoves. And there are essentially 2 main types of canister stoves. Ones with integrated canisters like this one, where the canister is sitting directly underneath the camping stove, and ones with remote canisters where the canister is upside down and connected to the camping stove with a hose. For most backpackers, I recommend getting an integrated canister stove, and I recommend one model in particular, the BRS 3000T, which I have over here. Essentially, it's a very, very inexpensive camping stove. You can get it on AliExpress for less than $10, and as far as I know, it's the lightest and the smallest camping stove out there, which is why this camping stove in particular is used by a lot of ultralight hikers. The only downside to integrated camping stoves is that they don't work very well in freezing temperatures because the gas inside the gas canister becomes liquid and it isn't able to go out from the canister in an efficient manner, so it isn't able to keep up a flame unless the canister itself is warm. One tip to avoid this from happening is to always keep your gas canister deep inside of your backpack when hiking in freezing temperatures, and when you've set up your tent, keep it inside of your sleeping bag so that it's warm and it's able to work efficiently. As for the gas canisters themselves, they cost about $5 to $10 each, and you can get them in most outdoor stores, fishing stores, and hardware stores. You can usually get about 15 to maybe even 40 uses from this small gas canister, depending on if you're just boiling water to reach boiling temperatures or you're boiling the water for longer, for example, to cook pasta. As an example, when I'm through hiking, one gas canister usually lasts me for about 2 weeks. One thing that I bought and started using somewhat recently is this small adapter that you can get on Amazon for about $20, and it essentially allows you to transfer gas from one gas canister to another. And this is useful because as you're hiking more and more, you'll have a lot of these half full, almost empty gas canisters laying at your home because you don't want to bring them on longer trips where you need to be certain that you'll be able to have some kind of fire to cook your food. One other thing that you'll need is a spork. I recommend going with titanium or plastic, it doesn't really matter. You also need some kind of a pot, and I recommend going with titanium and going with about 800 to 1.5 liters in size. You also need some kind of a cup to make your coffee or tea, and I recommend getting a cheap silicone camping cup. Some people also like to bring a plastic or titanium plate, although I personally don't usually bring this because I can eat straight out of my pot. When you've cooked your food inside of the pot, you'll also need to wash it. I usually don't use any soap, I just clean it inside of a stream. And for scrubbing the pot, I usually use this plastic netting that usually a lot of vegetables come pre-packaged in supermarkets. I prefer this over a sponge because it's more abrasive, so you're able to get food scraps off the pot more easily, but also it doesn't soak up a lot of water, so when I'm finished with using it, I can just put it inside of my cooking pouch and nothing will get wet. You also need to bring some kind of a rag or a towel to clean off your pot once you've washed it, and I recommend getting these light load towels, which come packaged in this very small package, and essentially there are reusable towels that last a very long time, that pack down incredibly small and are incredibly lightweight, and yet at the same time they absorb a lot of water, so I definitely recommend getting them. On a side note, I also recommend these light load towels to use as your towel when through hiking. For example, after you've taken a swim or you've taken a shower in a campsite, you need to bring some kind of a towel to dry yourself with. And these light load towels are perfectly suited for that as well. They pack down incredibly small, they soak up a lot of water. Definitely take advantage of these. I also always bring a small mocha pot on my hiking trips, although I know that it's definitely an extra because it's pretty heavy and it takes up quite a bit of space in my backpack. However, for me it's definitely worth it because in the mornings I like to have a good and strong espresso, but it's definitely up to you if you bring this. When it comes to footwear, I would most definitely recommend you to get some kind of dedicated hiking footwear because normal shoes usually don't have enough traction, they aren't breathable enough, and also they don't usually have enough padding, which means that over the long run you'll get more blisters than necessary. There essentially are three main types of hiking footwear, which are hiking boots, hiking shoes, and trail runners. And I would say that the distribution between them among hikers is pretty much equal. So it's mostly a matter of preference which type you choose. I will not judge you if you choose any other type of shoe. However, me personally, I prefer trail runners. So you can usually find trail runners at any outdoors or sports store in general in the trail running section. And I personally like them because they have a lot of good traction. They're meant for running on rocks. They're very breathable, very comfortable, but most importantly, they're the lightest of all of these types, which means that you can do more distances over the long run because you're saving more energy on your feet. Hiking shoes are almost like trail runners, but they're a bit stiffer and a bit heavier because they're made from a bit thicker material, so they offer more padding and more protection for your feet. So they're also a good option, but it's just that I personally prefer trail runners. And lastly, we have hiking boots. And personally, I'm not a very big fan of those, although I do understand why people use them. It's just that they're too big and too heavy and too cumbersome for me specifically. There's one very big benefit for hiking boots, which is why a lot of people use them, is that they go over the ankle, which means that they protect your feet overall a bit better. And because they go over the ankle, you're less likely to sprain your ankle if you slip. However, in reality, if you're used to hiking on rocks, you do ankle stretches, you're very, very unlikely to sprain your ankle even when hiking with trail runners or hiking shoes. And that's the main reason why I personally don't use hiking boots unless I'm hiking in winter. There's actually also a fourth type of hiking boot called insulated snow hiking boots, and those are usually meant for hiking in winter because they have more padding, more insulation inside of them. They're almost completely waterproof usually, and they're also a bit taller compared to those mid-height 3-season hiking boots. If you're planning on hiking in winter, I would most definitely recommend you to get them, even though they are pretty expensive. I'm telling this from experience because in the beginning I tried hiking in winter with my 3-season hiking boots, and it definitely wasn't a good experience because my feet were always cold no matter what I did and no matter how many pairs of socks I wore. Now, when buying new hiking footwear, I definitely recommend you to shop it locally instead of buying online because you have to try the shoes on yourself and they have to feel perfect on your feet. If something feels off, for example, the toe box is too small or the shoe is moving around the ankle area or the heel feels a bit too tight, then definitely try on another shoe until you find something that fits you perfectly, because I can guarantee you that these places will turn into sore spots and then into blisters, and you don't want that to happen. So the main things that you're looking for are padding. The shoe has to be very comfortable. You'll also need to have a shoe with good traction that shouldn't slip on rocks or gravel and so on. It should also be wide enough in the toe area, and when you lace it nicely and tightly, it shouldn't be moving up and down, otherwise you'll get blisters. I also personally prefer breathable hiking shoes over water resistant ones because from my own experience, as you're hiking in wet areas or in rain, all shoes get wet eventually. The only difference is that breathable shoes dry quicker. However, take it with a grain of salt because I mostly hike in a somewhat dry area, and for example, if you live in Norway or Canada and you're hiking in wet areas for the most part of the year, then maybe getting water resistant shoes is more sensible for you. Some people also bring camp shoes, which could be Crocs, slippers or something like that, but me personally, I think it's a luxury item and I don't really see the need for them, so in my opinion it's a wasted space and wasted weight, but it's totally up to you. And one last thing that I wanted to talk about regarding footwear is this one lacing technique that I learned a few years ago, and now I'm using it on all of my shoes. The main idea with this lacing technique is that you'll be getting more room in your toe box, which means that your fingers will be less squished together and you'll be less likely to get blisters. So you start by tying your shoe through the first loop over here, but then instead of crossing it like this, you go over here on the side. I've now skipped the first cross and the second cross as well, and on the third cross, instead of simply crossing it, I'm gonna tie an overhand knot, and notice that I'm gonna do one more turn, and this is now called a surgeon's knot. And essentially what this does is that it will keep this part of the shoe separate from this one. So this part will be able to stay nice and loose, and this one will be nice and tight. And now I need to continue tying the rest of the shoe as I would normally. And finally, tighten the shoe as you would normally. An overhand knot and then another overhand knot on 2 loops. And that's it. Now in the end it feels like this part of the shoe is very tight. It isn't moving up and down, front or back or whatever, but at the same time this part of the shoe feels very loose and I now have more room in the toe box. This technique is good for trail running shoes, hiking boots, whatever. Just make sure to skip the first few loops, first 2 or 3 loops, then do a surgeon's knot, and then continue tying the rest of the shoe normally. A very simple but very effective lacing technique. One really important thing that I see a lot of beginner hikers underestimate is socks, because if you go out hiking in regular cotton or synthetic socks, you'll surely get blisters. If you want to avoid getting any blisters, then you need, first of all, good quality shoes that fit your feet perfectly, but you also need to have good quality socks that are made from the right materials. In my opinion, both of them are equally important. I've tried many different hiking socks, over 10 different models, ranging from cheap to expensive ones. And unfortunately, I would recommend you to get expensive hiking socks because I've tried all the cheap ones and they just all result in blisters. You usually need to spend around $20 to $30 for a pair of good quality hiking socks that won't get you any blisters. And from my own experience, I can recommend only 3 brands. The first one is Ultralight, the second one is Smartwool, and the third one is Darn Tough, which I think is the most popular one out of these 3. But the good news is that these expensive hiking socks also last a really long time. You can usually expect to get at least 2, 3, maybe even 4 years of hiking before you start getting any holes. When shopping for hiking socks, you first and most importantly need to look at the fabric composition. It should consist of 30 to 60% merino wool, which will give the sock its moisture wicking ability and odor resistance. It should also consist of 30 to 60% polyester or nylon, which will give the sock more durability and also some water resistance. And finally, it should consist of 1 to 5% elastane, spandex or lycra, which will just make the sock more stretchy. You also have to look at some other things as well. First of all, you have to get it in the right size so that when you put it on, the sock should feel pretty tight fitting and not move around. Otherwise, it will cause some abrasion and cause blisters in the long run. Secondly, it should have more padding around the toe box as well as the heel area, because these are the 2 areas where you're most likely to get blisters. And lastly, I would recommend you to avoid getting shorter hiking socks and instead get a bit longer ones, because they will help you protect your feet a bit better against spiky grass, against wet grass, and also against ticks. Other than that, here are some other tips to help you avoid getting blisters. First of all, get into the habit of taking off your shoes and socks as well whenever you take a longer break to let your feet air out, because blisters develop much quicker when there's wet skin, because there's much more abrasion between the sock and the skin. The second tip is that if you start to feel a sore spot on your feet, don't be lazy. Take off your shoes and tape it immediately with Leuko tape, because otherwise if you don't do that, you'll for sure get a blister really soon. And lastly, I would recommend you to always bring at least 2 pairs of hiking socks, one to hike in and one to sleep in, or to change into if the other pair gets wet. Also, if you're on a longer hike, make it a habit to wash your socks every 2 or 3 days. Otherwise, the material becomes stiff from all the sweat and dirt that goes into it, and it becomes more abrasive and it's more likely to cause blisters. As a beginner on a budget, you probably don't need to buy any base layers. However, they do offer a very good weight to warmth ratio, so if you plan on hiking a lot, especially during the cold season, then I would recommend that you do invest in some kind of base layers. But before we talk about them, I wanted to talk about the concept of layering, because it's really important. Now, when it comes to hiking or being active outdoors in general, layering in many different layers is better compared to wearing fewer, thicker and insulated layers. For example, when hiking in winter, I could be wearing 5 different layers on top and 3 different layers on bottom instead of wearing one and thick insulated jacket and insulated pants. We do this because it allows us to be a bit more flexible depending on what kind of activity we're doing and the weather conditions outside. For example, I could take off a layer or put one layer back on depending on the temperature and depending on my own physical activity. And this is really important for managing sweat, because when you're out in the cold season, you don't want to sweat and you don't want that sweat to be absorbed by the layers that you're wearing on top, because when they get cold, they aren't able to insulate you as well and you become colder in the long run. For hiking in autumn, winter and spring, I almost always bring a base layer bottom and a base layer top to sleep in, but also to wear underneath my regular clothing to add a bit more insulation. Personally, I wouldn't recommend you to buy merino wool base layers at the beginning, because they offer only a minor advantage over synthetic base layers, which are much cheaper. I got this cheap synthetic base layer set on Amazon 5 years ago for about $20 or $25, and it's still going strong and I'm still using it today. The only downside to these cheaper synthetic base layers is that they start to stink much quicker. For example, these ones, they start to stink after 1 or 2 days of rough hiking, whereas a merino wool base layer will start to stink only after 3, 4, 5 days. They also aren't as breathable compared to merino wool, and they also have a bit worse weight to warmth ratio. But overall, the improvement for merino wool is only minor, so as a beginner, definitely get cheap synthetic base layers. The only upgrade that I would recommend you to eventually get if you're planning on doing a lot of winter hiking is mesh base layers. I know it sounds a bit weird, but these mesh base layers with these big holes in the fabric actually do feel warmer compared to normal tight weave base layers. You're supposed to wear them right next to your skin underneath other layers, and the way that they work is very similar to dawn insulation. So essentially you trap in a lot of air in these mesh panels, and then this air is heated up from the heat coming out from your body, and it acts as a barrier between the cold air coming in from the outside. They're also really good for doing physical activities outdoors in winter, because as you're doing physical activities, you're sweating, and in these mesh base layers, the sweat is able to evaporate very efficiently, so the base layer fabric itself doesn't get wet and it doesn't directly touch your skin. In normal tight weave base layers, whether it's synthetic or merino, it doesn't matter. All of the sweat gets trapped inside of the fabric gets wet, and then it touches your skin and you'll eventually become cold. The only downside to them is that they are very expensive. You're looking at about 70 euros for a top and another 70 for the bottom part, so they're definitely not for everyone. I've personally also tried both synthetic and merino wool mesh base layers, and I would say definitely get the synthetic one, because I can't really feel the improvement from merino wool in a mesh base layer. It's less durable, it's more expensive. Simply get the synthetic mesh base layer. But again, as a beginner, you probably don't need this. You'll do just fine with a cheap synthetic base layer. I would say that any beginner needs to invest in some kind of rain gear, because once you get wet, you'll eventually become cold, and that could lead to hypothermia, which can be very dangerous. If you live in a somewhat warm and dry climate, then getting only a rain jacket will probably do just fine. I prefer rain jackets specifically over ponchos and raincoats because they act as another layer of insulation. For example, if you're wearing a fleece or a down jacket underneath a rain jacket, then the rain jacket blocks all of the incoming wind, so no cold air is able to get through, and in the end you end up feeling much warmer. In my opinion, it's also easier to deal with backpacks when wearing a rain jacket because you can wear a backpack on top of the rain jacket instead of wearing underneath a poncho or a coat. If you're on a budget, then luckily there are a few good options that I would recommend, like the Frog Togs or the cheap Decathlon 4-class rain jacket. They're both very lightweight, affordable, and mostly waterproof. However, they do come with some downsides as well, like for example, they aren't very durable because they're made from cheap synthetic fabrics. They also aren't very breathable, and they also don't come with a lot of extra features that you would want on a rain jacket. But for occasional hiking in rain, I think they'll do just fine. However, if you're planning on hiking in rain more frequently, then getting something more expensive in the $70 to $100 range, for example, like this rain jacket, the Marmot Precip, I would say it's definitely worth it. When buying a more expensive rain jacket, there are a few more important features to look out for. First one, and most important one, in my opinion, is the weight. It should weigh between 200 to 300 grams. Another really important feature are pit zips, which are these ones over here. If you don't have them and you're hiking in a closed rain jacket in rain, eventually you'll get wet inside anyway from your sweat, even though the material itself isn't passing through any water. The next most important feature, in my opinion, is the hood. It should have some kind of adjustment straps so that if heavy wind is blowing, the hood won't blow off. Also, you should be able to turn your head and the hood shouldn't move in front of your vision. And also this area on your chin, it should mostly be covered. Otherwise, the wind will push through a lot of rain through over to your neck and you'll feel very uncomfortable. Another useful feature to have is an adjustment strap over here at the bottom, which again is very useful if you're hiking in very windy conditions. I also think that Velcro clips are a bit better compared to adjustment cords here at the wrists because it allows you to tighten them a bit better. And the last useful feature to look out for are pockets, because it means that you can put your hands inside of them when it's raining to keep them out from the rain. However, if you live in a more northern climate and you're planning on hiking in rain more frequently, then I would also recommend you to get some waterproof rain pants. I've had these cheap rain pants from Decathlon that I bought for I think about 20 euros for several years now, and they work perfectly. I also like that they work as another layer of insulation similar to rain jackets. You can wear them on top of your regular hiking pants when, for example, when hiking in snow in winter, and it will block all of the incoming wind, all of the incoming moisture from the snow, and in the end you'll feel much warmer. One thing that I wanted to mention about rain gear specifically is that eventually the rain coating will wear off, and eventually all rain jackets will start to pass through some water and you'll become wet when hiking for extended periods. However, you can fix that very easily. You can usually buy waterproof sprays in some outdoor stores or some other waterproof products that you need to put inside of the washing machine together with your rain gear, and it will essentially return the water resistance of the rain jacket or the rain pants to how it was originally when you first bought them. You usually need to do this once every 2 to 3 years, depending on how frequently you hike. Another thing that you could look into if you'll be hiking in rain for very long periods are waterproof rain socks. Of course, your feet will still be wet from them because they aren't very breathable, so your feet will be sweating and they'll become wet, but essentially they make you feel warmer because you aren't letting through all the cold moisture from the outside. It's just the sweat. They're very useful when hiking in rain in cold seasons. I personally don't use them myself because I live in a somewhat dry and warm climate. However, that is something that you could look into. Another thing that I recommend for hiking in rain are thin synthetic gloves, because even if they do get wet, they do provide some sort of insulation, which means that your fingers won't become as cold. They're especially useful when hiking with trekking poles because your hands are always exposed to rain and cold air. This just makes your fingers feel much warmer. And one last thing that I wanted to talk about regarding rain is, what do you do when you have wet socks and you're sleeping in a tent? If you hang them inside the tent or outside, unless it's sunny, usually they won't dry during the night because the air is very cold and very humid. The only real way to dry wet gear is with your body temperature. So for example, if you have wet socks, just put them underneath your shirt next to your skin overnight, and In fact, in just a few hours, they will be completely dry. Of course, it is a bit weird and maybe disgusting as well, putting wet socks underneath your clothing directly next to your skin. However, do trust me, it works. Also, for example, if you have a wet t-shirt or wet shorts or something like that, then the best way to dry it overnight is to simply wear it inside of your sleeping bag. The next best thing that you could do is put it inside your sleeping bag at the bottom of it. However, it doesn't work as well compared to when it's next to your skin. However, one word of caution is that you need to be sure that your sleep system is warm enough so that you can sleep inside of it in a bit wet clothing and you can still feel warm enough. If it isn't warm enough, then definitely don't do it, because otherwise you could get hypothermia. Before we talk about summer clothing, you should understand the differences between the different fabrics used in hiking clothing, and I would put them into three main categories: cotton, synthetics, and wool. Let's start with cotton. And there's one saying that's very popular, it's that cotton kills. And while I don't necessarily agree with this statement, I don't think that cotton is a good fabric that's used in hiking clothing. Cotton is heavy, it's abrasive, and most importantly, when it gets wet, it soaks up a lot of water. So it becomes even more abrasive, it becomes even more heavy, and it loses almost all of its ability to keep you warm because it loses most of its insulation. So personally, I would recommend you to avoid cotton fabrics if possible. Although if you're going to be wearing just a cotton t-shirt and everything else is synthetic or wool, you probably won't feel that much of a difference. Moving on to synthetics, they're divided into many different smaller subcategories like nylon, polyester, polypropylene, Coolmax, and other different fabrics. But in my opinion, the differences between them are very minor, so I'm going to be talking about synthetic materials in general. I would recommend that most of your summer clothing is made from synthetics, including hats, t-shirts, sun shirts, fleeces, shorts, trousers, and everything else. It doesn't even have to be specifically made for hiking. If it's synthetics, it's thin and breathable, then probably it's good for summer hiking. Synthetic fabrics are so good because they're durable, they're very lightweight, they're not very abrasive, so they're soft to the touch, and also, most importantly, they don't soak up a lot of water. So for example, if you get drenched in rain, the fabrics will get wet, but not nearly as much compared to cotton, and it will dry off very quickly. So synthetics are pretty much the perfect material for summer hiking. And then there's wool, which is divided into wool, merino wool, and alpaca wool. I would say that as a beginner, you definitely don't need to get any merino wool t-shirts, sun shirts, fleeces, and so on, because it offers only a minor improvement at a very much higher cost. The only real benefits of merino wool for summer hiking is that they're more breathable, and also they develop bad odors in a much longer time compared to synthetics. So for example, this merino t-shirt will probably start smelling bad only after 3-4 days of intense hiking. For summer hiking, you'll definitely need some kind of a cap to block the sun, otherwise you risk getting heat stroke or heat exhaustion. It doesn't matter what kind of cap it is, as long as it's synthetic, it blocks the sun, and it isn't too thick. Another really useful thing that I recommend getting is a long sleeve sun shirt, because it allows you to use less sunscreen and it allows you to stay a bit cooler because you're not exposed to the sun as much. When shopping for a sun shirt, ideally get one that has a hood. This one doesn't, but ideally you get one that has a hood so you can stay out of the sun even more. It needs to have long sleeves, it needs to be very thin so that you aren't overheating, and most importantly, the fabric needs to be very tight weave so that it doesn't pass through any sun rays and you're able to stay out of the sun without using any sunscreen. You also need some kind of shorts for summer hiking. I personally use cheap, synthetic, and very thin running shorts for hiking. Even when hiking in summer, you need to be prepared for lower temperatures, especially if you're hiking in mountains where the temperatures could drop even below freezing during the night. So here's how you do that. First of all, I don't really see a need for bringing a beanie when hiking in summer, even when hiking in the mountains, because if you're bringing a sun cap and your rain jacket has a hood, in my opinion, it's almost as warm as wearing a beanie. So keep your beanie at home. As the exterior layer, I recommend using your rain jacket because you're going to be bringing it anyway to protect yourself from rain, so why not use it as well for keeping you warm? But you're going to be getting most of your warmth from the mid layer, and as the mid layer for a beginner on a budget, I would definitely recommend going with a cheap synthetic fleece, for example like this one that I bought on Decathlon for 10 euros. It doesn't have to be a fleece made for hiking specifically, as long as it's a synthetic fleece. pants. Another option for a mid-layer when hiking in summer is a thin insulated down jacket. And depending on where you live and your hiking conditions, I would recommend you to get this one as well, because you're going to be needing it anyway if you're planning on hiking in winter. And I do recommend one model in particular, the one that I'm wearing. It's the cheap down jacket from Decathlon under the 4-Class brand. It costs about 50 euros. It packs down really small. It's really lightweight. And for the price that you're paying, you're getting a really good deal. There's also nothing wrong with getting a synthetic insulation jacket. However, from my own experience, down insulation jackets just have a much better weight to warmth ratio, and they also pack down much smaller. For summer hiking, I usually don't bring a base layer top because I don't really see a need for it, and instead I wear my sun shirt and my t-shirt underneath just to add a bit more insulation and a bit more warmth. That said, I do recommend bringing your base layer bottoms when hiking in summer, because you can put them underneath your shorts in the evenings when the air temperature becomes colder. I prefer bringing these instead of bringing dedicated hiking pants to change into during the evenings, because it ends up being a bit lighter and also a bit warmer and more comfortable as well. And lastly, regarding your underwear, anything that's comfortable, thin and synthetic will work just fine. As we talked about before, the most important thing for staying warm in winter is layering in many different layers instead of just wearing a few big layers. Now, this is an example of what I would be wearing normally when hiking in winter, except of course I would probably be wearing insulated hiking boots. So over here I have a merino wool beanie, although any synthetic beanie will do just fine as well. Over here I have a thin synthetic buff, which protects my neck a bit better. And also I can put it in front of my face in case there's a lot of cold air blowing straight in my face. It's also really useful when sleeping, especially if you're sleeping with a quilt and your face is exposed to the cold air. It protects you a bit better. Over here I have thin synthetic gloves, which are good to use when you're more active and you're moving, and for times when I'm not moving, when I'm colder. I carry snow gloves as well, which have a waterproof membrane from the outside and a lot of insulation from the inside. I would definitely recommend these for anyone who's hiking in snow. As mentioned before, as the outer layer, I'm wearing a rain jacket because it blocks all of the incoming wind, so no cold air is able to get through, and in the end I end up feeling much warmer. Underneath, I'm usually wearing a down jacket, and right now I'm wearing the thinner down jacket from Decathlon. I also own a more expensive down jacket that costs about 5 times more, and even though it is better, it's warmer, it has a better weight to warmth ratio, it has more features. For beginners, I would definitely recommend to get a cheaper down jacket. That's because you can achieve a similar warmth at a much lower cost simply by wearing other layers underneath this down jacket. For example, you could be wearing another fleece or another base layer underneath and you would be as warm. As the mid layer, I'm wearing an alpaca fleece, although you could be wearing a synthetic fleece as well. So this alpaca fleece costs about 100 euros, so it's pretty expensive. For a beginner on a budget, I would definitely recommend you to get a cheap synthetic fleece because the improvements that you get from a merino or alpaca mid layer are only minor. Alpaca wool or merino wool mid layers are usually only used by ultralight hikers that continue hiking in the cold season because they offer better breathability, they have a better weight to warmth ratio, and also because they start to develop bad odors much later compared to synthetic mid layers. And underneath, right next to my skin, I'm always wearing a base layer when hiking in winter. In this case, I'm wearing a mesh merino wool base layer, which is pretty expensive. However, you could substitute this with a cheap synthetic base layer, which would also do just fine. And if it's even colder than that, then I might be wearing even 2 base layers or 2 fleeces or a thicker down jacket or something like that. Essentially, I need to increase the layers as the temperature goes down. A lot of times I'll also bring a sun shirt, which I'll wear directly on top of my base layer, because as you're hiking during the day, if the sun comes out, especially if you're higher up in the mountains, it can become very hot, and I'll be wearing just this. And I essentially need to bring all of those extra layers to put on top in the evening when the sun sets, because then the temperature drops very quickly. I also prefer layering my bottom part as well instead of wearing a pair of insulated trousers. So on the exterior, I'll usually be wearing rain pants because they block all the moisture coming in from the snow and also the cold air. Underneath, as the mid layer, I'm usually wearing thin, regular hiking pants that are meant for 3-season hiking. And underneath the hiking pants, I'm usually wearing thermal bottoms right next to my skin. By the way, this isn't a very common way of layering your trousers. What most people do is buy some kind of soft shell or hard shell pants that usually have some kind of water resistance and insulation instead of bringing rain pants and normal hiking trousers. Personally, I don't do that because I don't think there's really a need for it, because I can layer in many different layers and achieve the same result. My current system is waterproof, it's insulated, and it essentially achieves the same purpose without needing for me to spend any extra money on insulated hiking pants. And lastly, regarding hiking in winter, there's one phrase that you'll hear very frequently, which is be bold, start cold. The main idea behind it is that when you start hiking, you should feel marginally cold, because otherwise you'll start hiking, you'll become hot, and you'll start sweating, and you'll need to take off those extra layers anyway. So for example, if I'm hiking in freezing temperatures, before I start hiking, I take off the down and rain jackets and put them inside of my backpack at an easily accessible place, and I only put them back on whenever I pause and take a break. That way I can avoid sweating and avoid becoming cold. While we're on the subject, let's talk about some winter hiking tips. So first of all, how do you get water in winter when everything outside is frozen? The answer is pretty simple. You simply need to melt some snow. But melting snow actually isn't that easy, because if you simply take some snow and then put it inside of your pot and cook it over a fire, first of all, you're probably going to ruin your pot, because you're going to ruin the coating of the pot because the temperature will be too high. But secondly, it's also a very, very inefficient way of melting snow. So what you need to do first is pour some water inside of the pot, maybe 2 or 3 centimeters, and then add all of the snow gradually over time so that it keeps melting over time, because this way is much quicker and much more efficient. To feel a bit warmer during the night, make sure to go out and pee before going to bed, because your body uses up some of your energy to keep the urine inside of you warm. So that in turn makes you feel a bit colder. Also make sure that if you need to go out during the night, in the middle of the night, to do it instead of being lazy, because then afterwards you'll heat up more efficiently. Just before going to sleep, make sure to eat some fatty foods instead of snacks with a lot of carbs, especially sugar, because fat burns down much slower compared to carbs, especially sugar, over several hours instead of just a few hours. And as it burns down, it turns into energy, into heat, which in turn makes you feel warmer on the inside. So essentially you're able to stay warm for 4 or 5 or even 6 hours if you eat a lot of fatty foods instead of just 1 or 2 hours. Always make sure to switch to completely dry socks just before going to sleep, because in dry socks your feet will be warmer. Sometimes you don't even feel that your current socks are a bit damp, but if you change to dry socks, you'll feel the difference. You'll feel that the current socks that you're wearing are a bit damp from all the sweat that's coming out of your skin. So always switch to dry socks before going to sleep. If you're wearing 2 pairs of socks, make sure that they aren't compressing your feet, because that will reduce the blood flow in your feet and in turn make them feel colder. For me personally, the best combination is wearing normal merino wool socks next to my skin, and then as the outer sock, wearing normal wool socks that are very loose fitting and very thick. And if you're sleeping in extremely cold temperatures, maybe -7, -10 or below that, then one other thing that you could do is purchase a pair of down booties or down slippers. These ones actually aren't insulated by down. These are synthetic insulation down slippers, which I purchased for around 20 euros, and they keep my feet extremely toasty. Easily one of the best winter purchases that I've made so far. You also need to understand that the sleeping bag doesn't warm you up. Instead, it works as a thermos. It keeps all of the warm temperature coming from your body inside of the sleeping bag. So this means that if you go to sleep feeling cold, you'll have a lower body temperature, so you'll emit less heat and you'll warm up very, very slowly. So one thing that you can do to warm up a bit quicker is do some exercises just before going to sleep, like squats, push-ups, jumping jacks, running around the tent, or something like that, to increase your body temperature. There's also one myth that I hear very, very frequently, is that if you sleep naked or only in your base layers, you'll warm up quicker and more efficiently. And that just simply isn't true. Obviously, the more layers that you're wearing, for example, a down jacket, a hat, pants, and so on, you're adding more insulation with each layer, so in the end you'll feel much warmer. But you should make sure that all the clothing that you're wearing isn't constricting your blood flow, because that will make you feel cooler. And also it shouldn't be too large for the sleeping bag, so that the sleeping bag itself isn't compressing the insulation, because then it becomes much more inefficient and you'll feel cooler. Having said that, from my own experience, sleeping only in your base layers inside of the sleeping bag feels much more comfortable. So if the temperature allows for it, if my sleeping bag is warm enough, I usually sleep in my base layers and I only add another layers on top if the temperature gets lower and my sleeping bag isn't warm enough. One mistake that a lot of beginners make is breathing into their sleeping bag, and you definitely shouldn't do that because, of course, instantly you'll feel a bit warmer, but over time you're introducing a lot of moisture inside of the sleeping bag, which reduces the effectiveness on the insulation. So in the long run, you'll feel colder. One thing that can help with keeping your face warm is a buff, which you can wear on top of your face to cover your nose and your mouth. When you're tucking in inside of your sleeping bag, also make sure to use the tightening cords around the hood so that there aren't any gaps coming in through your neck and making you feel cold. If you're struggling to stay warm in your sleeping bag, try to understand where the cold is coming from the sleeping pad or the sleeping bag. Because if, for example, it's coming from the sleeping pad, then the first thing that you could do is try sleeping on the side instead, for example, on your back or on your belly, because then a smaller part of your body is being exposed to the cold area, which is in this case the sleeping pad. Another thing that you could do is put something underneath the tent, underneath the sleeping pad itself. For example, some moss, some leaves or something like that to add more insulation and to keep yourself a bit further away from the cold ground. But if, for example, it's the sleeping pad that's keeping you warm and the rest of your body is feeling cool from the sleeping bag, then you should definitely sleep on your back or on your belly, because then you're exposing a larger part of your body to the warm area. Another thing that you could do if you're struggling to stay warm in your sleep system is warming up some water just before going to sleep, pouring it inside of a water bottle, then putting it inside a sock, and then putting it inside of the sleeping bag between your thighs, because this will give you a boost in warmness and you'll be able to feel warm at least for a few hours until the bottle cools off. Another thing that's really important when camping in winter is the placement of the tent, because if, for example, you set it up in a more covered area next to some higher bushes or underneath some trees compared to, let's say, a more exposed and windy area, then you'll end up feeling much warmer during the night. The difference in this case can be up to 2, 3, maybe even 4 degrees, which doesn't sound that much, but it actually is. Just make sure to set up your tent in a safe area so that nothing falls on top of it during the night. So, for example, you shouldn't set it up underneath some bigger trees that could fall themselves, or with bigger trees that have a lot of big branches that could fall directly on top of the tent. To minimize this risk, I usually set up my tent underneath some higher bushes, preferably, but I could also set it up underneath some trees if the trees look very healthy, very thick, and they're not very tall. You should also understand the physics between cold air and warm air. So essentially, cold air is heavier because the molecules inside of it are closer to each other, so it's heavier, and when put next to each other, cold air tends to fall down, while hot air tends to move up. This is relevant for hiking because as the sun sets, it isn't heating up the air anymore. The ground is now cooler and it's cooling off all the air above it. So essentially it's introducing a very big mass of cold air very quickly. And what happens with this big mass of cold air, if you're hiking in the mountains, it tends to fall down because it's heavier than hot air. It tends to pool up and accumulate at the bottom of valleys because essentially it's got nowhere else to go. So if you set up your tent directly at the bottom of a valley where all the cool air tends to accumulate during the night, then you could be exposed to temperatures maybe 3, 4, 5 degrees Celsius lower compared to setting it up a bit higher. And the last tip regarding winter hiking is if you're making a fire, don't set up your tent right next to it and don't dry your gear directly on the fire. I've ruined way too many pieces of clothing, boots, and I've even gotten holes in my tents because I set up my tent too close to the fire and then the embers fall on top of it and make a hole. And this is especially important with hiking boots and hiking shoes because if you put them too close to the fire, the glue that's keeping the shoe together will come undone and you'll essentially ruin your hiking shoes. I've done this way too many times myself, so please learn from my mistakes and don't repeat that. A much safer way is by putting something inside of the boot which absorbs the moisture, like for example napkins, newspapers, or something like that. But now let's talk about how do you take care of your hygiene while you're out on the trail. So let's start with the first thing in my hygiene kit, which is a highly debated deodorant because about 50% of hikers use it and 50% of hikers don't. I personally use it before I go out on shorter hikes, but when I go out through hiking, when I go out on these very long hikes, I think that bringing a deodorant is pointless. It just takes up needless space inside of your backpack. Actually, when you're through hiking, when you're out there for 5, 6, 7 days or more, something interesting starts to happen with your nose because you start to stop picking up on all the natural smells. So for example, if you're hiking together with a friend or a bunch of your friends and you're all sweaty, then you start to not feel that after you're out there for a very long time. Instead, you start to pick up on all the unnatural smells. So for example, deodorant, laundry detergent, perfume, or something like that. So as an example, when you're through hiking and you pass by another through hiker, you both usually feel normal to each other. You don't smell or anything like that. But when you pass someone who's out there for a day or two, who has fresh clothing and deodorant, you instantly start to pick up on that, and the smell feels very, very unnatural and very strong. Moving on to something else, there are two other things that are way more important than deodorant, which are chapstick and sunscreen. Chapstick is very useful to keep your lips from drying out when hiking in very high elevations, when hiking in very hot and sunny days, or when hiking in cold and windy weather. And sunscreen is very important to use on hot and sunny days as well. However, it's really important to use when you're hiking in the mountains in very high elevations, because then you're closer to the sun and you're exposed to much more sun radiation, so you get burned much more quickly. You'll probably learn this from experience yourself, but for example, one time I forgot to put on sunscreen when I was hiking above 2,000 meters elevation for about 3 or 4 hours in a very cloudy day, and by the end of the hike I was completely red and sunburned. So definitely make it a habit to always use sunscreen when you're hiking in the mountains. Another thing that you'll need to have in your hygiene kit is a toothbrush. I use a small travel toothbrush and also a small travel toothpaste. One tip is that you don't need to keep buying this small travel toothpaste over and over again, because you use it very quickly, and instead you can refill it from a larger toothpaste, which is very easy to do and ends up being much cheaper. And by the way, you can do the same thing with sunscreen, because for example, this small sunscreen bottle costs almost as much as this bigger one, which has 3 times as much sunscreen. Another thing that you could bring instead of a small travel toothpaste are toothpaste tablets, which I haven't tried myself, honestly, but they seem like a very great choice for hiking because of the small size and small weight. Another thing that I bring on my hikes that are longer than 4 or 5 days, where I need to wash my clothing, is eco-friendly travel soap. But again, I don't usually bring this larger bottle. I just bought it because it's cheaper, and instead I refill it into these smaller bottles. Of course, this isn't always possible, but you should try to wash your clothing whenever you visit a campsite, for example, in sinks, in showers, or something like that. Because when you use these even eco-friendly soaps in rivers, lakes, and so on, they aren't that friendly for the marine life, and they're still polluting. Regarding hygiene, I also always carry another Ziploc bag, always ready at hand, in case I need to do the number 2. And by the way, when you're through hiking, it really should be ready at a moment's notice, because as you're hiking these long hikes, something in your body changes. I don't know what, but something does. And when you need to go and you need to do the number 2, you start to feel it instantly, and you need to go in like 5 or 10 minutes. I'm not even kidding. I'm not a health expert. I don't know why this happens. I know that it happens to marathon runners as well. I think it has something to do with our bodies trying to do these very, very long distances. And essentially, when you need to go, you need to do it very quickly. So in my kit, first of all, I always carry a trowel, which is essentially a small spade meant for hiking that's very lightweight and small. In my opinion, everyone should have this, because first of all, it isn't expensive. It costs about $10 to $20 depending on which one you get, and we all should clean after ourselves instead of leaving it out there in the open, left for everyone else to see. In the same bag, I also always carry some toilet paper or napkins in this case, and also some hand sanitizer to wash my hands after I've done it. So when I need to do it, the first thing that I do is go at least 50 meters away from the trail, out in some bush cover where nobody can see or hear what I'm doing. Then you find an area similar to this one, which is a bit covered and has good and soft ground with not a lot of rocks inside. And then you simply dig a small hole. The hole doesn't need to be very big, something like this, maybe a hand's width and about 15 to 20 centimeters deep. Then what you need to do is squat over this hole, do what you need to do, and then throw all of the toilet paper inside of this hole. And finally, what you need to do is simply bury it. Make sure to bury it pretty well, and also stomp on it with your feet so that no animals try to get inside of it because of the smell. And yeah, in the end, it should look something like this, very clean, almost like nothing has happened here. I remember doing this the first time, felt very awkward and very disgusting as well, but honestly, over time, as you do it more and more, when you're through hiking, it feels even cleaner and more natural than going to a disgusting public toilet. So it will all come and it will feel normal. It's not that bad. The last thing that I have in this bag is a pack of wet wipes. So what sometimes happens is when you're through hiking, you can't find a lot of good places to wash yourself for 2, 3, maybe even more days, and you develop bad odors, and overall you just feel very dirty and like you don't want to continue hiking. Having a few wet wipes in your backpack definitely helps because it means that you can clean your dirtiest, most smelliest parts, and after that you'll feel very refreshed and you'll have more energy to continue hiking. You should make some kind of a repair kit as well to fix problems with your gear, because eventually these will happen. I usually keep my repair kit at home on shorter hikes, and on hikes that take 3 days, 4 days or longer than that, while I'm through hiking, I definitely take a repair kit with me to fix problems with my gear out on the trail. So the first thing that I have in my repair kit is a small piece of duct tape to fix any holes in rain jackets, tents or something like that, because duct tape is extremely effective at this and it is water resistant. I know that some people, instead of bringing duct tape like this, like to tape it around their trekking poles and then keep it on there at all times and use it when needed, but I personally prefer to bring it like this. Inside of this small roll of duct tape, I also keep a small needle, and also inside of my repair kit, I also have some tooth floss, because some repairs require something more compared to just bringing duct tape. For example, a lens could break on your backpack, so you need something stronger to keep both of them in place, or a corner of the tent breaks off or something like that. I prefer using tooth floss instead of regular thread because first of all, it's much stronger. You can get much better repairs using tooth floss instead of regular thread that breaks very easily, but also it's a 2-in-1 item. I can also use it to floss my teeth. Just make sure to bring a large enough needle so that the hole in the needle is large enough to pass through tooth floss. And finally, you need to have some kind of way to repair a leaking inflatable mattress or an inflatable pillow. And for that, you can use an airtight patch or simply to bring gear repair glue. Personally, I like to use both. I like to bring these patches on my thru hikes when I need to do some quick repairs out in the field, and I like to keep the glue at home when I need to do some larger repairs at home. I personally also use this glue to fix holes in my down jacket and my down sleeping bag, because if I have a rip in it, down feathers usually escape from it over time, and I don't want that to happen because that will worsen its insulation capabilities. I also keep some bigger patches at home if I want to do some more visually pleasing repairs, because putting a glue on it isn't that beautiful. I can personally recommend the Gear Aid glue, which I've used for a very long time, and you'll find it in most outdoor retailer stores because it's one of the most popular gear repair glues out there. But it does have one issue. This tube is pretty large and I usually need to use only a small bit of it, so if I just close it and then put it inside of my closet for about 6 months and forget about it, after 6 months it will dry out and will not be usable again. So one thing that you can do, what Gear Aid recommends themselves to do it to preserve its life, is when you use it once, put a bit of aluminum foil on top of it, close it, and then put it inside of the freezer and keep it there. Whenever you need to use it, just take it out a few hours before you use it and then put it back in the freezer. This way you can use this tube for years. You're going to want to keep all of your electronics in some kind of a waterproof bag. I usually keep mine in this blue waterproof dry sack, although you could definitely put them in a bigger Ziploc as well. Another thing about electronics that you're going to want to do when hiking in winter is to keep them dry, because otherwise they might not function very efficiently. For example, your phone could switch off or your power bank could stop charging your other devices. That's why you should always keep your electronics somewhere close to you, close to your body heat, maybe for example in your pockets, or you can put them deep inside of your backpack so that the cold air isn't able to get through them. And during the night when you go to sleep, you should put all of your electronics inside of your sleeping bag, probably at the bottom of it next to your feet, and simply go to sleep. First of all, you'll need some headlamp to see outside when it becomes dark. Whichever headlamp you get, whichever model, doesn't really matter as long as it works. Personally, I've tried more expensive headlamps, like for example this Ultralight headlamp from Nightcore, and I've also tried cheaper ones that you get on Amazon for about $20. And honestly, both of them, they weigh very similarly, they take up a similar amount of space, and they work also the same. So it doesn't really matter what kind of headlamp you get. One question that I sometimes get is, where do you keep the headlamp during the night? I usually do it 50-50. Sometimes I keep it around the neck, hanging over here while I'm sleeping. Sometimes I also hang it by the zipper of the tent so that when I need to exit the tent during the night, I know where the headlamp is and I can access it very quickly. The next thing that you'll need is some kind of a power bank. And although any power bank will do, there is one power bank that's very popular among thru hikers. This one is the Nightcore 10,000 milliamp hour ultralight power bank, and this is extremely popular among thru hikers because it's really small and it's also really lightweight, and you can actually save quite a bit of weight at not that high of a price, so I would definitely recommend it. One electronic device that's definitely optional is an electronic air pump, although I always carry it with me myself because personally I really hate blowing up mattresses with my lungs because it makes me feel dizzy, and this thing helps with that. On some trips I bring this FlexTail ultralight pump, which does the work just fine, and on some trips I bring this pump instead, which is a bit larger. It's a FlexTail tiny pump because it also works as a lantern, and this is especially useful in winters when the evenings are longer and I, for example, want to read a book inside of the tent. One accessory that I definitely recommend for anyone is a fanny pack, a bum bag, or a waist bag, whatever you want to call it, it's the same thing. That's because it allows you to store all the quick grab items in there, like sunscreen, hand sanitizer, your phone, wallet, and stuff like that. It also transfers some of the weight over to front of you, which means that you're going to be carrying it with your legs and hips instead of your shoulders, which is always good because it means that after a long day of hiking, you're going to have a bit less shoulder pain. Of course, the difference is minimal because the fanny pack is not heavy, but anything helps really. I personally never carry a camp chair, although I know that there are now quite a few good ultralight options that aren't too big and aren't too heavy. However, if you're mostly doing overnight hikes and you're mostly out there to get a camping experience, to get a good camping experience, you know, chilling at the fire, drinking beers and so on, instead of just doing these very long distances every day and then just sleeping somewhere overnight, then getting a camping chair could definitely be worth it for you. I'm actually considering getting a camp chair myself for my winter hiking trips when the evenings are very long, when you're allowed to build a fire and so on. In those cases, despite the extra weight and the extra size, getting a camp chair is worth it in my opinion. Another accessory that you might want to get are quick tie laces, because it means that you'll be able to take off your shoes more easily, which means that whenever you stop and take a break, you'll be more likely to take off your shoes to air out your feet, which means that in the end you're going to have less blisters. I do use them on some of my shoes, but not all of them, because in my opinion the difference that you get from them compared to normal laces is minimal. Another accessory that you might want to get is a thermometer, because it will allow you to understand what the temperature was outside during the night, which means that you can understand what temperatures your sleeping gear is good in, and it will allow you to plan a bit better for your future hikes. I usually carry this small electronic thermometer that I got on Amazon for $20 because it records the temperature during the night, which means that in the morning when I wake up, I can check what the temperature was like in the night, and it allows me to understand what temperatures my sleeping gear is good in. In my opinion, the best place to start looking for gear are used goods marketplaces. For example, Facebook Marketplace, Craigslist if you're from US, or Vinted if you're from Spain, Italy, France, and so on. That's because very frequently you can get very good deals there, especially if the gear is a few years old and newer models have come out and people have just upgraded it, even though the older model is still just as good. If you prefer buying your gear locally and you live in Europe, then the first place that I would recommend checking is Decathlon, just because of the vast variety of gear that they offer at affordable prices. I will admit that sometimes their quality isn't perfect, especially for their very cheap gear. However, for the most part, it's good enough for the price. If you want to purchase online and you live in Europe, then the first place that I would recommend, that I usually choose myself, is Bergfreunde, which is the biggest outdoor retailer here in Europe. You can find a lot of high quality branded outdoor gear products, a lot of ultralight products as well, at fairly reasonable prices. If you're shopping for cheaper hiking gear and you don't care about the brand, then I don't like to use it myself, but unfortunately still the best option is to go on Amazon. If you live in the US and you want to shop your products locally or order online, then probably you're going to go to REI, which is the biggest outdoor retailer in North America. I've purchased some gear from them as well, but unfortunately if you're doing it here in Europe, then you have to pay import taxes because it's shipped from the United States, and also the shipping times are pretty long. I would say that their quality is pretty much just like Decathlon. It's definitely not perfect, but it's not bad as well, especially for the price. Another retailer for outdoor gear specifically that has grown a lot in recent years due to their YouTube advertising policies is garagegrowngear.com. I personally haven't shopped there myself, but I've heard that the quality is pretty good and there's a very big variety of smaller brands. So if you want to support that, definitely check them out. And the last option, of course, is to shop at each individual manufacturer individually at their own website, because you're not paying anyone else, any other platform. You're directly paying the manufacturer, which is always a bit better and sometimes also cheaper as well. That's actually how I mostly use garage grown gear. I use it for inspiration. So for example, if I'm shopping for a sleeping bag, I go out there and I check all the available options and then see if anything speaks to me, and if it does, I check the manufacturer's website to see if they're manufactured in Europe or if they ship to Europe without any import taxes. All right, and now let's talk about how do you find good hiking trails that you're going to hike and how to navigate them. For finding good hiking trails, I recommend going to alltrails.com or wikilog.com. Alltrails mostly if you're from North America, and Wikilog if you're from Europe. I recommend their websites specifically instead of their apps, because if you go on their websites, you can look for good hiking trails in your area of interest. With the free version, you don't have to pay for anything. Then you can look for a hiking trail that you like specifically and download the .gpx file that you're going to need to later import on your phone and to actually navigate the trail. The easiest way to navigate is by using your phone, and the best free hiking app that I recommend for doing this is Gaia GPS. All you need to do is transfer the .gpx file that you downloaded from your laptop to your phone. Then you need to open the Gaia GPS app, import the .gpx file, and then it will show up on the map inside the app and you're good to go. To follow the trail, you'll need a phone with an internet connection. So what you do is you open the app, you're going to see the trail on the map itself, then you're going to see a dot. This is where you're located at the moment, and all you need to do is simply make sure that you're following the trail at all times. It's as simple as that. Having said this, very frequently you can't rely on an internet connection when you're out in the middle of nowhere. For example, here where I'm filming, I'm getting no reception right now. In cases like these, you can still use your phone, but you need to make sure that you have offline maps. The problem with this is that usually this is a paid feature on most hiking apps, including Gaia GPS. However, there is one free workaround that works on most hiking apps, including on Gaia GPS as well. It's to download the offline maps in your phone's cache. So what you need to do is first import the trail as you did before. Then while you're connected to the internet, before you go out hiking, you zoom into the map and then you follow along the whole trail. You need to make sure that you follow along the whole trail. Now when you switch off the app and then turn on airplane mode and then open the app again, you're going to see that all the areas where you zoomed in previously are now in high definition, and all the areas where you didn't zoom are blurry and fuzzy. This means that you've now downloaded the areas where you zoomed in previously in your phone's cache, and they're stored there for offline use. I've used this trick to follow along a through hike as well without buying any paid hiking apps, and it worked good. However, this isn't a very safe solution because you aren't necessarily in control of how the cache is downloaded and when it's being deleted, because it depends on the developers of the app. So what I'd recommend you to do instead is to get a paid hiking app to get good, reliable offline maps. My current two favorites for paid hiking apps are Goat Maps and Gaia GPS, in this order, because of their ease of use and because of their simple to understand yet very detailed hiking maps. By the way, currently Goat Maps is only available on iOS. Unfortunately, it's still not available for Android. Goat Maps is actually made by the previous developers of Gaia GPS because they got tired of where Gaia GPS was heading. It was more of a overall outdoors app, and instead they wanted to create something for hiking specifically. It's still a very new hiking app, but I personally prefer it over Gaia GPS. The prices are changing all the time, but currently Goat Maps will cost you around 30 euros for the whole year and Gaia GPS about 60 euros for the whole year. In any case, whichever app you choose, Goat Maps, Gaia GPS or anything else, if it has offline maps, all you need to do is when you're out in the middle of nowhere, simply make sure that the location of your phone is turned on that uses GPS, and it should all work. By the way, when you're out hiking, I would advise you to switch on airplane mode because it saves the phone battery by a lot. Because if you don't do that, the phone is always searching for the nearest cell towers and it's always trying to find one at a distance, and it isn't able to find one, so it uses up a lot of battery. It drains much quicker than normally. You should also preferably always carry an extra Ziploc bag to put your phone in to protect it from getting wet in case it starts raining. For navigating in not extremely remote locations, using only your phone is probably good enough. However, one rule of thumb is to always have some kind of backup as well. For the backup, you have several options to choose choose from. Older hikers usually use a map and a compass because that's what they grew up with and they're familiar with. Newer hikers a lot of times just bring a spare phone that they're not using anymore. Just make sure that it's charged and that it also has the same offline maps that you have in this phone. Just carry it in a Ziploc, and in case this stops working, you always have a backup. Or another option is more costly. It's to use a GPS watch or a GPS device that has an even better GPS connection compared to your phone. If you're hiking with a lot of friends and all of you have phones with you, then you probably don't even need a backup, because if your phone stops working, chances are that theirs will still work. In any case, whichever type of backup you're using, you should always have some, because you don't want to get lost in the middle of nowhere. I personally prefer to use a GPS watch as my second navigating device. So before I go out hiking, I find a route or I create one, and then I upload it to my phone and my GPS watch. And then while I'm hiking, I navigate 90% of the times using the GPS watch. I just put up my hand, I can see where I am and if I'm still following the trail, and it uses up very little battery compared to my phone. And I only take out the phone when I want to look at the map in more detail. For example, to find water sources, camping spots, alternate routes, and so on, because the maps on the GPS watch aren't that detailed. I personally think that for thru hiking, having these two is currently the best option. But the bad news is the GPS watches are pretty expensive. For example, this one costs 400 euros, but you can also get fairly reasonable GPS watches at around 200 euros. So if you're starting on a budget, which is what I did several years ago, you can just start navigating on your phone and use another phone as a backup, or use a map and a compass as the backup. Now let's go over how to read a map. And you always want to be using a terrain map, because here in the outdoors, it's much more efficient and much more beneficial to have. Each line represents changes in altitude, and there usually are numbers showing you how much of a change it is. So if the lines are far from each other, it's a flat area. And if they're close together, it's a steep cliff, and you definitely don't want to be hiking there as a beginner. The green areas are wooded areas, and the yellow or white areas are meadows or rocky areas with not a lot of tree cover. The larger lines are usually paved roads. The dotted but still a bit wider lines are usually unpaved roads, although not always, and the dotted lines are usually hiking trails. Usually a black dotted line means that the hiking trail is fairly easy, and a red or a green one means that it's either overgrown or dangerous, so avoid these ones at first. Another thing to look out for are water sources and river crossings, which usually are marked as blue lines, which could be a river or a stream. But if you're looking to collect drinkable water, then ideally you're looking for a water source symbol, which means that it's specifically marked as a place to fill up treated or untreated water. My advice is that the first times when you go out, keep the map open on your phone and just look around at what's nearby and where you are on the map. And try to see if you can spot in the distance any mountains that you see marked on the map, or by the elevation lines if you can see any valleys or hills or cliffs or something like that. And over time you'll start to understand how to read these terrain lines a bit better. For example, right now, just by looking at a map, I can quickly determine any potential campsites that are good and flat and well protected. I can compare different hiking trails based on their difficulty just by looking at the map. I can find water sources, any alternate routes and stuff like that. But don't worry, because if you keep doing this and if you keep practicing over time, you'll become good at this as well, and it will all come natural. Now let's move on to safety tips, and let's start with SOS devices. These are special GPS devices, usually very expensive, that can get a phone signal in places where a phone simply can't. Usually people who go out outdoors carry these in case of an emergency, and they hope that they never need to use them. So that could be a broken leg if you're out in the middle of nowhere, if you're lost, if you're stuck in a natural disaster or something like that. I was very reluctant to get one for myself in the beginning because they're quite expensive, and for the first 5 or 6 years I was hiking without one, even sometimes being out there by myself without a phone connection for up to 2 days time. Now obviously this wasn't very responsible, because in case something would have happened, I would have had no way of getting in touch with anyone, because I was essentially out in the middle of nowhere for days. The good news is that if you aren't hiking in that remote places and you're hiking in places with mostly good cell reception, even out in the middle of nowhere, then you probably don't need a device like this. However, if you're hiking in more remote places more frequently, and especially if you're doing some more dangerous stuff, then you will probably need one. These things usually cost starting from 200 euros, and they also usually have a subscription cost that's usually about 10 to 20 euros per month. I mostly use this thing because I have a wife, and it allows for me and for her, more importantly, to feel more safer. For example, I can press a button over here, and it will send her my current location and let her know that I'm fine, that I don't need help and stuff like that. Of course, it is a bit expensive, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. Another very big thing that you're going to need is insurance, because if you have an emergency situation and you need to be rescued out in the mountains or in the middle of nowhere, it's usually done by a very large team, usually with a helicopter as well. And after the fact, you're going to be charged a very large bill if you don't have insurance. If you're lucky, maybe 10K, maybe less than that, but if you're unlucky, it could be upwards of 100K or even more. For this purpose, I recommend joining a mountaineering club, which usually costs 100 euros for a yearly subscription. For example, here in Italy, we have the Club Alpino Italiano, or other popular clubs in Europe are the Austrian Alpine Club, the German Alpine Club, and other clubs like that. By the way, you don't need to be, let's say, in Italy, Germany, or Austria to join these clubs. You can do that from other countries as well. Usually they cover mountain rescue costs as well, and not only within the country itself, but internationally up to a certain amount. And also, as an added bonus, you also get discounts in a lot of refugios and mountain huts all across Europe. The next tip might seem very basic, but it's a very important one. Do not go near cliffs. I was honestly doing this myself all the time. Whenever I saw a cliff, I approached it, I looked over it just to enjoy the view and stuff like that. But one time I went next to the edge and I lost balance. I didn't fall, but I lost balance. I didn't think of anything of that at the time, but later, as I was repeating that in my head, I realized that it could have been a very bad situation that would have risen from a very stupid mistake. Continuing about hiking in the mountains, you always have to be on the lookout for any potential incoming storms, especially if you're doing a very high mountain pass or when you're above the tree line in general. First of all, you have to be on the lookout for any potential lightning, because that can be very dangerous when you're very high up in the mountains, because lightning, it tends to strike in very open areas, so above the tree line. If you see a storm approaching and you're currently above the tree line, then what you need to do is get down lower in elevation and hide underneath some bushes or underneath some tree cover. Having said that, lightning and thunder can be a bit tricky sometimes as well, because oftentimes it's only forming in the mountains. For example, you're hiking above the tree line and you see that it's only a bit cloudy outside. What you need to do then is look at the hairs in your arms. If they start standing up, then it means that lightning is currently forming, and what you need to do then is get down lower in elevation as soon as you can. In general, that's why most people do higher mountain summits and go up higher in elevations in general early in the morning and go down by the afternoon, because in the mountains, thunderstorms are most likely to happen during the afternoon. But when you're hiking in the mountains, you shouldn't be careful only of storms that are forecast to be bad, because storms that are forecast to be small can turn bad very quickly. For example, they can have extremely high winds, extremely high precipitation, trees can fall and stuff like that. So you have to be very careful with that. Another thing that can happen after storms when you're hiking in the mountains is that small streams and washes can turn into rivers, which means that on the way back, the small stream that you crossed previously now requires a river crossing, or you need to wait out until it turns into small stream again. Also, be very careful when hiking in very windy days or after some very heavy rains, because that's when branches can fall on you, that's when rocks are falling off cliff sides because of the rains, that's when trails get washed out, that's when landslides happen, and so on. When hiking in winter on snow on very steep sections, make sure to always dig in your toes with each step and make sure that you have good grip before placing the next step so that you don't slip down this steep section. Ideally, you should also carry micro spikes, especially if you'll be hiking on very icy terrains with a lot of hard-packed snow. These things essentially go over your hiking shoe or your hiking boot, and they essentially add metal spikes to the bottom part of the boot, which greatly improves the traction, especially when hiking on ice and on very hard-packed snow. When hiking in winter, especially when hiking in the spring, be very careful where you place your step, because underneath your feet there could be a small stream or even a river where you could fall into without even realizing it. And now let's move on to animals, and let's start with ticks. When you're hiking in tick territory, always make sure to use a tick repellent to avoid getting Lyme disease and other tick-related diseases. Also, make sure that you're vaccinated against tick-borne encephalitis. In fact, one of my friends currently has it, and for him, personally, it's really serious. He has even been introduced into a coma to fight off the disease, so it can be extremely serious, so make sure that you're vaccinated. Another very simple way of preventing tick bites is to make it a habit to always check your clothing as well as any open skin for any ticks and remove them manually if needed before they bite you after hiking through some tall grass or some bushes. Next, you also need to learn how to remove a tick without taking its head off. Essentially, you need to avoid squishing the tick too hard, and you need to grab it by the head so that you remove it together with the head and it doesn't release all the infections that it has inside of the tick, inside of your skin. Especially when hiking in Europe, you'll encounter a lot of pasture animals, which statistically speaking can be even more dangerous than wild animals in most areas. First of all, be very careful when approaching unfenced horses or cows. I remember one time I was hiking with my dog and my wife, and we went around the corner and instantly there was a cow in front of us, and what the cow decided to do was to attack us because she was with her babies and she thought that my dog is going to attack her. So it instantly started rushing us, running after us, but luckily there were some bushes nearby. We ran into them together with my dog, and luckily it stopped there, but it could have been really bad. So always be very careful when approaching cows and horses. You also need to watch out for shepherd and herding dogs, especially if you're hiking with a dog yourself. Usually though, they're mostly all bark, no bite. However, it's best to stay on the safe side and go around them if possible. I've personally had many bad experiences where I encounter a very aggressive shepherd's dog, especially here in Italy, because the farmers here, they don't really care about anyone else who is in the mountains, especially not hikers. They just need to protect their herd, so they put an aggressive dog to protect it. So always just walk around it if you can. If you're hiking here in Europe, the only wild animals that you're most likely gonna encounter are foxes, wild boar, and deer. And out of these three, the most aggressive one definitely is wild boar. Although deer can be aggressive towards human as well, especially during spring and early summer when they have their newborn babies. But they won't be aggressive towards you by default. They'll only be aggressive towards you if you surprise them. So what you want to do is to not surprise them. So if I'm hiking on very overgrown trails where I can't see a lot in the distance, where there are a lot of bushes in front of me, I try to be as loud as I can. For example, I can whistle, or I can say, hey, hey, or I can clap my hands and do stuff like that to let them know that I'm approaching before I go around the corner and allow them to escape if they want to. You could of course encounter some wolves and bears as well, but unless you're hiking in Romania, you shouldn't really be worried about them because you're extremely unlikely to encounter them. And even if you do, they're usually very scared of humans, so they're just going to run away and nothing is going to happen. The only place in Europe where you're very likely to encounter bears is Romania. So when hiking there, avoid hiking alone and preferably also bring a bear spray. However, if you live in the United States or Canada, then in some areas a bear spray is definitely necessary and you should also learn how to use it, not just carry it. And lastly, if you want to avoid wild animals and sleep safely during the night, never ever leave food inside of your tent, and also don't eat it right next to the tent. I always put all of my food inside of a dry sack and hang it up a tree at least 50 meters away from the tent, and I also eat the dinner at least 50 meters away from the tent. When I just started out hiking, I didn't do this. I usually left all of the food inside of the tent, but I started doing this after one bad experience when through hiking in the Pyrenees, when some wild boar tried to get inside of the tent during the night. Essentially, after this experience, I started hanging my food and not eating next to the tent, and after that, no wild animals have tried to get inside of my tent. If you're prepared, if you know all of the risks, you know how to minimize these risks and what to do in case something happens, then you should be safe. Learning what food to bring is one of the most efficient and one of the best ways in saving weight in your backpack on multi-day hiking trips. A lot of beginners tend to bring those quick ramen noodles where you pour some hot water on them and they're ready essentially, or they bring something with a lot of protein because hiking is a sport and you need protein, right? But those two things aren't necessarily the best hiking foods. The real answer hides in calories, because when you're hiking, especially when you're doing those very long hiking trips that last several days or even weeks, then you essentially need to double your daily calorie intake. So as an example, if you're normally eating 2,500 calories on a normal day, then if you're through hiking, you need to eat at least 5, even 6,000 calories every day. And those kinds of calories are very hard to reach, and that's why you often see a lot of through hikers losing a lot of weight even though they're eating all kinds of different junk. First, you need to understand that every gram of fat contains 9 calories and every gram of protein or carbs contains only 4 calories. So 1 gram of fat equals more than 2 grams of protein or carbs. So if you're looking for the best weight to calorie ratio, then you need to look at fatty foods. One way to reach these 5,000–6,000 calories that you need while through hiking every day way is to bring olive oil. I bring my olive oil in this spill-proof bottle. I usually carry 2 of these on my thru hikes, and it just adds a way of adding extra calories to my dinners because I add a few teaspoons of this and then I get a few extra calories. Some other food that you could bring to add a few extra fat to your meals to get those extra calories is coconut oil, butter, peanut butter, nuts and seeds in general, and other foods like that with a very high fat content. You get the rest of your calories from protein and carbs. For snacking, I usually bring nut and oatmeal bars, nuts, dried fruit, fresh bread and cheese, if I can find it in a store, cookies, candy, pastries, and stuff like that. For breakfast, I think a very good option that contains a lot of calories and doesn't weigh a lot is a good old porridge. I simply bring a bit of oats in a Ziploc bag, which I then pour some hot water on top of them. Then I add some peanut butter, nuts, dried fruit, and stuff like that to make it more tasty and add even more calories. And it ends up being a very good and tasty breakfast that fills you up for a very long time. And for the dinner, you essentially got quite a few options to choose from. I usually like to cook my own dinners by mixing several different foods. I start by adding some carbs, and I do that by boiling some pasta, couscous, quinoa, or something like that that is very calorie dense, lightweight, and yet at the same time doesn't require a very long time to boil them. And then I add some protein, which usually is texturized soy because it's extremely lightweight and it contains a lot of protein. And it's one of the best ways to add protein to your dinners while hiking. But a lot of times you can't find texturized soy, especially while through hiking in those small stores. So what I would do instead normally is I would add some canned chickpeas, canned beans, canned meat, or something like that to add a bit of protein to my meal. Having said that, if you bring canned goods, you should preferably empty them out while you're still at the store to remove most of the liquid because it weighs a lot, and instead put them in a Ziploc bag, for example. Another good source of protein while hiking is canned fishes, but I usually don't add them to dinners because they ruin the taste. I eat them by themselves, and also beef jerky. And to add some taste to my dinners, I usually bring a container with salt and peppers, but I might also add something else to this container as well, like for example some herbs, curry, or something like that to add a bit more taste to my dinners. Instead of making your own meals, another option which a lot of people do because it's much easier but also much more expensive is to bring dehydrated meals. They usually cost about 6 to 10 euros per pack. They contain about 600 to 800 calories per pack, and all you need to do is boil some water, add it inside of the pack, then wait a few minutes and it will be good to go after about 10 minutes. Very convenient, but also pretty expensive. And one way that you could save some money on this is that whenever you're passing by an outdoor store or an outdoor outlet, which could be even better, is to go by the discounted section, because very frequently they put dehydrated meals there with the deadline nearing up, and they usually cost 2, 3, 4 euros, something like that. And in that case, it's not really that expensive for a meal that's very easy to do outside while you're hiking. You could also dehydrate your own meals, which ends up being a lot cheaper. You essentially just need to make a meal, put it inside a dehydrator for about 10 hours, and then you can rehydrate it just by adding some boiling water while you're out there hiking. It's very easy to do, but it requires you to dehydrate the food for several hours, and you also need to buy the dehydrator yourself. So it's a bit complicated, but definitely worth it. Lastly, here are some other smaller tips regarding food. So first of all, if you're bringing alcohol, if you're with your friends and you want to consume some alcohol, try to bring some spirits or something with a higher alcohol content in general instead of bringing beer, wine, or something like that, because it weighs much more. A lot of times you also don't need to bring, let's say, a full pack of rice or something like that, and instead you can just repack it into Ziploc bags that you can use later again, and that way you can save a bit of weight. One rule of thumb that I usually follow is that when I'm through hiking, I usually bring food for 1 day extra, or at least half a day extra. And when I'm out on overnight hikes, I bring just a few extra pieces of food, because food is actually pretty heavy compared to the rest of your gear. One other tip is not to bring any fresh fruits and vegetables because they're extremely heavy, because they contain a lot of water. So one thing that you could do is, for example, if you're through hiking, one thing that I did is that whenever I was in a city, I bought a lot of fruit. I ate it all at once at the city, and then I continued eating processed foods for the rest of the days. And then when I'm back at the city again, I consume some fresh fruit and vegetables. And now let's talk about wild camping and where you should be setting up your tent. So we already talked about how you shouldn't be setting up your tent underneath some bigger trees with a lot of branches that could fall on top of the tent, and that you also shouldn't set it up at the bottom of valleys because the air is much cooler there during the night. Having said that, you also shouldn't set up your tent at very exposed places, for example, ridges, mountaintops, and so on, if it's very windy outside or if it's very cold outside, because you'll be much colder there as well. Ideally, you want to set up your tent somewhere in the middle. So for example, if I would want to set up my tent somewhere in this valley, I wouldn't be setting up down over here because the cold air would drop down to it during the night and it will be too cold. And also at the top, it would be too exposed and too windy and also too cold. Ideally, I'd want to set it up somewhere in this tree cover over here, preferably towards the bottom, somewhere over here, most likely. You should also set up your tent at least 50 meters away from rivers, streams, lakes, and other water sources. First of all, to avoid condensation, but also to avoid animals, because animals usually go there during the night to drink. Another way of avoiding animals while wild camping is to not set it up on animal tracks, which look like overgrown trails in the middle of the forest where no human usually walks, but you can see that there is a trail. And also, obviously, don't set it up on regular trails or overgrown roads or something like that, because animals use that for traversing as well. If you're also seeing a lot of pasture animals that are running freely, which is very relevant here in Europe, for example, right now I can see a few cows and horses roaming down there at the bottom of this valley. Don't set up your tent right next to them. Set it up at least a few hundred meters away so that they don't come and disturb you during the night, because they're very interested in hikers usually. They probably won't stomp over your tent. They're smarter than that. They won't go over a tent. They don't even know what that is, so they're not gonna go over it unless provoked. But for sure, you won't get good sleep if you have a lot of cows or horses roaming right outside of your tent. I'm saying this from experience. If you're wild camping in Italy, France, or Spain, usually it's allowed if you follow the bivacco principle, which means that you set up your tent no earlier than 1 hour before sunset and you take it down no later than 1 hour after sunrise. And obviously you should also be staying there only for one night. You essentially should be only sheltering during the night instead of camping, making a fire, and doing stuff like that. In reality though, there are a lot of different regional rules. Each municipality, region, and stuff like that can set their own rules. So wild parks usually have different rules, but usually if you follow the bivacco principle, nobody will bother you, especially if you set up your tent out of sight. The worst that could happen is somebody could give you a warning. Of course, you could get a fine in theory as well, but that's extremely unlikely. The only place where I wouldn't recommend you to wild camp, even if you're following this bivacco principle, is in very popular and touristy areas with a lot of people that are trying to wild camp as well, because there usually are a lot more park rangers that probably hate tourists as well, and you're more likely to get a fine there. There are only a few countries in Europe, usually the northern countries, that allow you to wild camp legally, and these are Norway, Scandinavia, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Scotland, and I think that's it. Unfortunately, in the rest of Europe, in most European countries, wild camping is prohibited by law, except for a few designated areas. Having said that, most people wild camp anyway, even if they're from these countries where wild camping is prohibited in theory. Because if you do it in the middle of the night when it's darker, if you do it out of sight, you don't do it in touristy areas, you aren't making a mess, you aren't very loud, the reality is that nobody is going to catch you anyway. Having said that, I do agree with some wild camping laws. For example, if there's a very touristy area with a lot of people where a lot of people try to wild camp, who aren't very considerate, who leave a lot of trash, destroy the environment, yes, in those cases, wild camping should be prohibited locally in that park. Training for hiking a few weeks before you go out on a very long hike is one of the best ways on preventing injury. And realistically, I think the best way that you can train for hiking is by hiking. So a training plan would look something like this. A month before you go out on this long hike, you start hiking 2 times per week, and you start by doing shorter distances, maybe 5 kilometers if you aren't very used to hiking. And then you gradually increase this distance every week until you can easily do maybe 12, 13, 15 kilometers, something like that. Another thing to remember here is that you should be doing this with a packed backpack. So take your backpack and put at least 10 kilograms of stuff in there. It doesn't really matter what kind of stuff you put in there, as long as it's roughly 10 kilograms. Another thing that you want to do when training for hiking is doing regular exercises for training your muscles, most importantly your leg muscles, but also doing some stretching as well. First of all, you should be doing some regular exercises, maybe some regular squats, or doing this exercise. I don't know what's the name of this one, but it trains essentially the biggest muscles in your legs. Another exercise that I really like is this one, where you essentially do squats only with one leg. And another pretty good one is this one. Also this one. And I think this one is also a pretty good one. And another really good exercise for mobilizing all of the smaller muscles that you usually use with each step when you're trying to balance yourself, you're not even paying attention to, but you're using a lot of these smaller muscles, is to essentially stand on one leg for extended periods. At first you don't feel a lot, but after 30, 40 seconds, maybe even a minute, you start to feel all of these smaller muscles because you're trying to always balance yourself and you're always using these muscles. Oh yeah, I can start to feel my leg already. So keep doing this for a minute, maybe even more, then do it with your other leg and then repeat that maybe 3 times in total. It's also really important to stretch your ankles specifically to avoid ankle injuries, because ankle injuries happen because you don't have enough range in your ankle. So you need to increase that, and one way that you can do that is by stretching. So here are all the stretches that I do for my ankles. The first one that I do is this one, where you stretch it outwards. Then another one is the same one, just on the opposite side, stretching it inwards. This one is also pretty important. So you stand something like this, and then you move your heel backwards. You essentially try to put it to the ground. And the last one that I do is this one, essentially the same one as before, but you stretch it to the other side, something like this. I keep it for maybe 30 seconds, maybe even more. And lastly, I wanted to also say that I'm definitely not an expert in training for hiking. I learned most of this stuff from Chase Mountains, which is essentially a hiking YouTuber that goes very much into training for hiking. So if you're interested in training for hiking, definitely go and check him out. Here are some other smaller but still useful tips that I thought that didn't really fit into any other category. Instead of bringing a large wallet, bring a small Ziploc bag, or better yet, purchase an ultralight wallet. Bring a few of these reusable zip ties because they're very useful for securing something to your backpack. I personally use it whenever I wash my clothing to securely attach wet clothing to my backpack so that I know that it doesn't fall off and so that it dries off as I'm hiking. I usually bring 3 or 4 of these, and that's more than enough. If you want to have better sleep during the night, use some earplugs when sleeping in a tent, because I know that a lot of us want to stay in control, but I think that it does more harm than good hearing all the small critters during the night and waking up many times during the night. Realistically, if you don't keep any food inside of the tent, no animal should try to get inside because there's nothing interesting inside. When putting tent stakes in the ground, don't use your hand because you can injure yourself very easily, and also don't use your feet because you can bend the stakes very easily. I've done that many different times. So what you should do instead is use a rock if possible, but if you don't have any rocks laying around, you can also use the other tent stake. Simply put it over this one and push it inside. It also works like that. Before you start setting up your tent, first lay it out in the spot where you want to set it up and try to sleep on it for a few seconds to find out if there are any rocks that you still need to remove, or twigs or something like that, or if there are any holes, and to try to understand in which direction you should be sleeping in. It's much better to test that before you set up the tent so that you don't need to move it. Make it a habit to always double and even triple check the ground whenever you take a pause and you're ready to continue to start hiking again, because you don't want to hike after something that you have forgotten. Now let's talk about hiking etiquette, or some rules in general that you should follow. And let's start with a fire. Please don't build a fire if it's the dry season, because it's extremely easy to start a forest fire like this. A lot of times you think that you can be in control, when in reality it's very easy to lose control like this. As an example, together with my friends, we once built a fire when we were camping out in the middle of nowhere during the dry season. And we sat next to the fire for a few hours, and after a few hours we realized that the ground is getting hot underneath us, 2-3 meters away from the fire, and that there was actually some smoke coming out of the ground. So we removed the leaves and we realized that all of the tree roots underneath the leaves were starting to burn by themselves, and it was spreading all around the fire. Luckily we were right next to a river, so what we did is we poured a lot of water all around the fire, and we were able able to extinguish it that way. But if we would have left it like that, it would for sure start a forest fire. For building a fire, instead of chopping good healthy trees, try to use dead standing wood, because that one, first of all, burns better, but also you're not chopping down any trees needlessly. Also, whenever you extinguish the fire, make sure to extinguish it very well so that there's no embers left. And also, if you've built a new fire where there wasn't a fire pit before, try to hide it so that you leave it in a way to how you found it previously, so that you aren't creating a lot of these new fire pits out in the nature. Personally, I usually make fires only during winter or very late or early in spring, or if it's a dry season, I only make it in designated campsites inside of fire pits. This one is pretty obvious, but always try to bring all the trash that you make with you and then later throw it out when you're in a city. Lastly, I also wanted to mention that a lot of organic things tend to decompose and decay much slower if you're higher in elevation. And that's why often you see a lot of orange peels, banana peels, napkins, toilet paper and stuff like that just a few meters off the trail when you're hiking above the tree line or on mountaintops or in places like that. So if you're hiking at very high altitudes, please bring up all the organic trash as well and throw it out in the city. When you're wild camping, try to not camp on very obviously private lands that are fenced off with an area that's a pasture land or something like that, because first of all, you're more likely to get caught, but also if the owner finds you, try to be polite and say that you're sorry and move on, because if you're negative towards the owner, he's more likely to fence off the area and be very negative towards hikers in the future. So it doesn't help for all of us. So if possible, try to avoid camping on private lands, and if you do it very stealthy, and if you get caught, be very polite and say that you're sorry. And the last tip is that if you're hiking in a group, you should always hike in the pace of the slowest hiker in the group, because try to think of it from his or her perspective. If he's always the last one of the group and everyone is waiting for him, and as soon as he catches up everyone continues hiking, then he won't have a good experience. And if it's one of his first trips, he's less likely to have a positive experience and continue hiking in general. So if it's one of your friends, definitely try to hike at their pace so that they have a positive experience and they want to go out with you hiking again. And lastly, let's go over some thru hikes in Europe, North America, and the rest of the world so that hopefully you get inspired and you have something to look forward to. Again, I wanted to mention that we have posters for all these thru hikes that I'll be mentioning. So if you want to support this channel, go and check it out on trailgoals.com. And remember that you can get a 10% discount with the discount code OscarHikes. Starting with North America, here are the 10 most popular thru hikes in North America, starting with the longest ones and ending with the shortest ones. The first one is the North Country Trail, which could be one of the longest hiking trails in the world, if not the longest, which is 7,724 kilometers. Then we have the popular Continental Divide Trail, which is 4,989 kilometers. After that, we have the Pacific Crest Trail at 4,265 kilometers. And then we have the third of the Triple Crown, the Appalachian Trail, which is 3,540 kilometers. Another very long one is the Mountains to Sea Trail, which is 1,891 kilometers. Then we have the Arizona Trail, which is 1,288 kilometers and crosses the state of Arizona. Then we have the Great Divide Trail in Canada, which goes through the Rockies and is 1,123 kilometers in length and is a direct continuation of the Continental Divide Trail. Then we have Bruce Trail at 904 kilometers. Then we have the Vermont Long Trail, other called the Long Trail, 438 kilometers. And finally, we have the John Muir Trail at 339 kilometers. Moving on to Europe, again, here are the most popular thru hikes in Europe, arranged from the longest ones to the shortest ones. Starting with the very long Hexatrek, which is a fairly new long distance trail in France at 3,034 kilometers. Then we have the GR5 at 2,290 kilometers. Then we have the Via Francigena pilgrimage, which goes from England to Rome at 2,000 kilometers roughly. Then we have the GR10, which crosses the Pyrenees at 866 kilometers. But I also wanted to mention that there are two other very similar trails that cross the Pyrenees from west to east, the GR11 and the Haute Route Pyrenees, which are about the same distance. Then we have the Camino del Norte, which is a part of the Camino de Santiago at 820 kilometers. Then we have Camino Frances, again a part of the Camino de Santiago at 748 kilometers. Then we have Pieterpad at 498 kilometers. In England, the most popular one is the Coast to Coast Walk at 306 kilometers. Then we have Camino Portugues Coastal at 270 kilometers, again a part of the Camino de Santiago. There's also a Camino Portugues central route that is a bit longer. Then we have the Rota Vincentina, which is again in Portugal at 230 kilometers. Then we have a hike that's on my bucket list, the GR20 at 180 kilometers. Then we have the very popular Tour du Mont Blanc, which goes around the Mont Blanc and is 170 kilometers in length. And again in England, we have another popular trail, the West Highland Way, which is 154 kilometers. And finally, here are some other popular thru hikes in the rest of the world, not counting North America and Europe, again sorted by the longest ones to the shortest ones. The longest one definitely is Te Araroa, which crosses the whole New Zealand and is 3,000 kilometers in length. Then we have the Hasten Trail at 1,200 kilometers. Then there's another pilgrimage, the Shikoku 88 Temples Pilgrimage at 1,200 kilometers. Then we have the Australian Alps walking track sitting at 650 kilometers. Another pilgrimage is the Kumano Kodo at 642 kilometers in total. Then we have the Great North Walk at 250 kilometers. Another one is the Larapinta Trail at 223 kilometers. Then moving on to Nepal, we have the Annapurna Circuit at 220 kilometers. And of course, the Everest Base Camp Trek sitting at 130 kilometers. And in South America, we have the extremely beautiful Patagonia Torres del Paine Trek at 129 kilometers. By the way, I'm really sorry for butchering all of these names. I know I pronounced them extremely bad. All right, so that's pretty much it. This was definitely one of my longest videos. I actually started writing it back in November, and now I'm filming this in August, so almost a year to finish this whole video. Definitely one of my longest videos. So if you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing because I'm making some other good videos in the future. Yeah, if you have any other tips or anything else that you wanted to add, please make sure to write that down in the comments. I'll try to read most of them and also try to respond to a lot of these comments. And yeah, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in one of my next videos. Bye!